If you've ever wondered what it would smell like to walk into a world where deodorant hadn't been invented, plumbing was a rumour, and soap was basically a luxury item that you might get for Christmas if you were noble enough, congratulations, you've arrived in medieval Europe. And the first thing your nose says is, absolutely not. But don't worry. In the Middle Ages, smell wasn't a problem. It was a lifestyle, and it all starts with understanding that medieval hygiene wasn't a system, a routine, or even a coherent concept. It was more like a group project where nobody communicated. Half the participants didn't show up, and the remaining 2 argued about whether bathing might invite demons into the body. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To truly appreciate the chaos, imagine living in a time where infrastructure meant some wood beams that haven't fallen over yet, and medical science was powered by equal parts superstition and wishful thinking. Cleanliness wasn't a daily habit. It was a philosophical negotiation between what people wanted, what the church approved, what local water sources allowed, and how cold the weather was. Because in winter, bathing was the medieval equivalent of being dared to jump into a frozen lake. Only now there was no lake, just cold water in a bucket and a sense of dread. Let's start with the biggest obstacle of all, no plumbing. That means no sinks, no faucets, no pipes, no drains, and no convenient water pressure that lets you pretend you're in a shampoo commercial. Water had to be hauled by hand, bucket by bucket, from wells, streams or rivers. And every bucket weighed about the same as your regrets after staying up too late. So cleanliness wasn't just a chore, it was cardio. And cardio wasn't a medieval priority unless something was on fire. Because water was such a hassle to transport, people used it sparingly. And by sparingly, I mean the average medieval villager's daily hygiene routine could be summarised as Step 1, wake up. Step 2, hope for the best. Water wasn't even guaranteed to be clean. In fact, most of the time it wasn't. But medieval people didn't know that germs existed. To them, dirty water was inconvenient, not dangerous. Drinking from a cloudy stream, it builds character. Washing your face in water that had a mysterious leaf and possibly a small insect floating in it. It's natural. Bathing in river water that was upstream from other activities? At least it's wet. But even when water was available, a surprising number of people believed that too much bathing could actually make you sick. This wasn't laziness. This was science, medieval style. The body, they believed, had pores that opened during bathing. And once open, those pores could let in cold air, bad smells, evil vapours, sins, or mischievous spirits, because apparently your skin was a slightly confused hotel concierge. Doctors warned that frequent washing weakened the body or invited disease. So instead of washing regularly, people simply embraced the dirt. Some even thought that wearing layers of grime protected your health, like a medieval vaccine made of filth. And speaking of filth, let's talk seasonal smells. In summer, medieval towns baked under the sun like enormous, poorly managed compost heaps. If you lived near a market, you'd be treated to the scent of spoiled meat, fish guts, and vegetables that gave up on life several days ago. If you lived near animals, and most people did, the air carried a symphony of manure so powerful it could knock out a modern nose in under 3 seconds. Winter wasn't much better. The combination of human breath, damp wool, and smoke from indoor fires created a fragrance I will politely describe as moist medieval misery. And then there was the church to complicate things. Religious leaders didn't ban bathing outright, but they had opinions TM. They warned against public bathhouses, believing they have encouraged immoral behaviour. Some monks and nuns had cleanliness routines, but many preached that focusing on bodily needs was a distraction from spiritual purity. If you spent too much time worrying about your odour, were you really focusing on your soul? In fairness, smelling your neighbour probably encouraged prayer. As for the average serf or villager, Hygiene wasn't something they thought deeply about. Survival was the priority. If you're working from sunrise to sunset, trying not to starve, paying rent to a lord who collected taxes with the enthusiasm of someone emptying your pockets while making eye contact, washing your hair doesn't make the top 5 concerns. Medieval people lived in close quarters. Shared tools, shared clothing, shared beds, and occasionally shared fleas. Smell wasn't embarrassing. Whoa. It was community bonding. But perhaps the best way to understand medieval hygiene is to consider this. The Middle Ages were a world without mirrors. Most people had no idea what they looked like. You washed when you felt dirty or itchy, not when you felt socially obligated. No selfies, no reflections, no bathroom lighting accidentally exposing your entire soul, just vibes. So what we're left with is a culture that didn't ignore hygiene. It simply approached it with a combination of practicality, superstition, weather-based excuses, and communal resignation. Cleanliness wasn't a standard. It was a negotiation. And most days, dirt won by majority vote. Welcome to medieval hygiene. Chaotic, inconsistent, sometimes spiritual. Occasionally accidental and always memorable. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so are the smells. If you have ever postponed a shower one day too many and thought, wow, I'm being a bit medieval right now, let me reassure you, no, you're not. Medieval bathing habits operated on a different timeline entirely, something between occasionally and let's wait until the stars align and the water isn't frozen. Bathing wasn't a routine, it was an event, a production, a logistical challenge, a once-in-a-while encounter with water that required scheduling, muscle strength, and occasionally a priest's approval. To begin, let's enter the world of medieval bathhouses, the closest thing to a spa experience you could get back when spa day usually meant soaking your feet in warm water and hoping nobody stole your shoes. Public bathhouses weren't just for washing, they were social hubs. People went there to talk, eat, drink, relax, negotiate business deals, flirt, and, in some cases, engage in activities that made the church raise its eyebrows so high they nearly hit heaven's rafters. Bathhouses offered warm water, steam, benches, and buckets, and also a sense of community, because nothing bonds people faster than sitting in a wooden tub of gently suspicious water. Most bathhouses heated water using massive cauldrons and wood-fired stoves. Heating enough water for a bath was a Herculean task, not so much a pleasant preparation as a full-scale fire hazard. And because heating water took so long, medieval bathhouses had a strict rule. The water was not being replaced for every individual. Instead, it was recycled, which is a generous way of saying a lot of people sat in the same soup before you did. The water started the day as warm and clear, and by evening it had evolved into something with texture, colour, and probably a personality. But let's say you were wealthy or lived inconveniently far from a bathhouse. Then the only option was the private bath, a process so exhausting it deserved an Olympic medal. First, servants carried bucket after bucket of water from the nearest well or river. Then they heated the water one pot at a time. Then they hauled it into a wooden tub, a big barrel that looked like it belonged on a ship, because it probably did. By the time the tub was full, everyone involved needed a bath, except they were too tired to take one. Privacy was also not guaranteed. Wealthy households sometimes had bath tents, or fabric partitions, but these curtains were about as secure as a toddler's blanket fort. They blocked absolutely nothing, not the air, not the sound, and especially not the gaze of anyone who passed by. Bathing was personal, yes, but only in the sense that you personally hoped no one barged in. Even more charming was the practice of shared tubs, especially among families. Picture this: a wooden tub, water heated after hours of work, and then everyone climbing in one after another. First the father, then the mother, then the children in order of age, and finally the smallest, whose bathwater experience could be described as lukewarm broth, with bonus surprises. The youngest kid deserved a medal just for surviving. And for those thinking, surely nobles bathed more often. Not necessarily. While they had access to more water and more servants, Nobles often dreaded bathing because of long-standing medical beliefs that insisted frequent washing was dangerous. Medieval medical theory, built on ancient Greek humours and a dash of dramatic flair, warned that hot water opened the pores too widely, leaving the body vulnerable to corruption, cold air, bad vapours, and possibly divine judgment. Bathing too often was considered reckless, like trying to wrestle a wild boar or arguing with a bishop. Many physicians advised that full body baths should be rare and carefully timed, preferably when the individual was in a stable health and the weather was cooperative. Because of these beliefs, many medieval people favoured partial bathing, also known as clean only the parts that get judged. Washing hands, faces, and sometimes feet was common, but a full bath? That required commitment, courage, and maybe a good reason. Weddings, big holidays, recovering from a plague scare, those were bathing occasions. Tuesdays, absolutely not. In some towns, authorities even scheduled communal baths on certain days as an organised attempt to make the population temporarily less hazardous to inhale. These events were often cheerful, chatty, and filled with a sense of relief, because after a long stretch of no bathing, even warm water that had been socially shared was better than nothing. Of course, bathhouses weren't purely innocent places of relaxation. Their popularity sometimes made religious leaders nervous. Some clerics accused bathhouses of encouraging vanity, lust, or unregulated joy, all things the medieval church liked to keep under surveillance. During certain epidemics, bathhouses were also suspected of spreading illness. Not because people understood germs, no one did, but because being naked in warm water seemed like a suspiciously fun activity to be allowed during God's punishments. Still, even with all the obstacles, medieval people genuinely enjoyed baths when they took them. Contemporary writings describe luxurious details, floating herbs for scent, rose petals, warm milk baths for the extremely wealthy, and lute players providing music for relaxation. Some nobles even commissioned carved wooden tubs with built-in trays for food, wine, or extremely unstable candles. Medieval luxury wasn't subtle, but for the average person, a bath was significant precisely because it was rare. It marked a transition from season to season, from sickness to health, from harvest labour to winter rest. And when you finally stepped out of the tub, freshish and steaming, you didn't just feel cleaner, you felt victorious. A medieval bath wasn't about maintaining hygiene, it was about surviving it. If modern plumbing is a miracle, then medieval rivers were the miracle's chaotic, overworked, traumatised ancestors. Imagine one single body of water that tried, and failed, to be everyone's sink, bathtub, garbage disposal, laundry station, drinking fountain, fish supplier, dishwasher, animal watering trough, industrial dump and open sewer. The river was, quite literally, doing its best. The people, not so much. To truly understand medieval hygiene, you must picture a world where water wasn't something that came out of pipes. It was something you hoped wasn't frozen, contaminated, or upstream from something horrifying. The river was the heart of every community, which sounds poetic until you realise that hearts are usually not full of rotting vegetables, half-washed tunics, and the occasional goat that wandered too close to the edge. Let's begin with the river's first job, the medieval sink. If you needed to wash dishes, pots, pans, cooking tools, or your one wooden bowl you guarded like a dragon guards treasure, where did you go? Straight to the river. Soap was expensive, so people often relied on sand, ash, or good old-fashioned elbow grease, a medieval cleaning method that worked just fine as long as your definition of clean was flexible. Plates were scrubbed, rinsed, and proudly held up to the sunlight, still glistening with a few mysterious flecks. It was fine. Everything was fine. That same river also served as the medieval bathtub. If someone needed a full wash, which, as we learned earlier, didn't happen regularly, the river was often the most convenient place. In warm months, villagers waded in for a quick rinse, and children splashed around like joyful little bacteria distributors. In cold months, only the bravest or most desperate dared to step into the icy water. Bathing in winter wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a spiritual crisis. If you stayed in the water too long, you risked hypothermia. If you didn't stay long enough, you risked judgment from your mother-in-law. Truly, medieval life was a delicate balance. But rivers weren't just for washing bodies. They were also medieval laundromats, bustling with activity. Women gathered at the shore with wooden paddles and baskets full of clothing that had absorbed a week's worth of smells, stains, and possibly life lessons. Clothes were dunked, slapped, beaten against stones, scrubbed with lye, and hung to dry on bushes or ropes nearby. The riverbank became the medieval equivalent of a gossip hub, where conversations flowed as freely as the water, although the gossip was usually cleaner. Of course, all these uses had one minor problem. The river was already full of stuff, and not the charming kind. Medieval towns threw nearly everything into their waterways: leftover stew, spoiled produce, dead chickens, unwanted scraps, animal innards from butchers, broken pottery, and the emotional debris of a society that had decided waste management didn't need to exist yet. But the worst and busiest job the river had. It was an open sewer. Human waste, from chamber pots, outdoor latrines, and public facilities, often ended up dumped straight into the river. Sometimes it was tossed from a bridge, sometimes it was poured down small drains carved into the edge of the street, and sometimes people simply walked to the water's edge and made a deposit, contributing directly to the river's ongoing identity crisis. And if the mental image isn't horrifying enough, remember, people also drank this water. Yes, medieval people drank from the rivers they used for the everything else. They tried to scoop water from cleaner-looking spots, behind rocks, from shallow pools, from sections the current seemed to have rinsed recently. But the reality was the same. The water kept flowing, but your hopes didn't. Many towns tried to regulate what could or couldn't be dumped into the water, but enforcement was optimistic. Medieval officials would fine butchers for tossing animal guts into rivers, punish full households that dumped waste upstream from mills, and scold tanners, leatherworkers, for washing hides and chemicals in communal water. But the truth was simple. When you have hundreds of people, dozens of trades, and zero plumbing, the river ends up being a dumping ground no matter what laws you pass. Let's not forget the animals, who used the river as enthusiastically as the humans did. Pigs wandered along the banks, cows waded in to drink, horses splashed around while being washed, and geese treated the entire waterway like a personal vacation resort. Every creature contributed something to the river, most of it unpleasant. But perhaps the most chaotic role of all was the river's job as the medieval factory. Mills harnessed the water for grinding grain. Dyers mixed pigments, rinsed fabrics, and let the rainbow-coloured runoff flow downstream. Blacksmiths cooled metal tools in the water, leaving behind metallic residue. Brewers carried water by the barrel, which meant entire businesses were built on rivers that doubled as garbage collectors. And yet, despite the horrors, medieval people relied on rivers with unwavering loyalty. They didn't see them as polluted, because pollution wasn't a concept yet. They saw rivers as living, useful, generous, and powerful. The water might look murky, but it moved. It flowed. And flowing water felt so. After all, if it didn't smell as bad as the street, didn't that count as clean? In the end, medieval rivers weren't just natural features. They were overworked co-workers carrying everyone's burdens, secrets, refuse, hofer, and bathing water. They were the unsung heroes holding society together in a swirling, sloshing, questionable embrace. And looking at everything they had to endure, it's genuinely miraculous they didn't just pack up and leave. If you ever complain that your modern toilet paper is too rough or that the flush is too loud at night, please take a moment to appreciate the medieval chamber pot, an object so humble, so unavoidable, and so horrifyingly intimate that it deserves its own holiday in the history of human endurance. Forget swords, armour, or castles. This little bucket was the real ruler of medieval domestic life. First, let's be clear. In the Middle Ages, the chamber pot wasn't an accessory. It wasn't a backup plan. It wasn't something tucked away for emergencies. It was the toilet. Every home had at least one, usually more. If you had a bed, a bowl, and a chamber pot, you were considered adequately furnished. Toileting wasn't a room, it was an object, and that object followed you everywhere. Chamber pots were typically made of pottery, metal, or wood, depending on how much money you had and how likely you were to drop things in the dark. They sat quietly beside the bed, ready for nightly use. Why by the bed? Because midnight strolls to outdoor latrines were a dangerous combination of darkness, animals, drunk neighbours, and holes in the ground that didn't care about your survival. So instead, people went where they slept. Medieval romance must be interpreted with this reality firmly in mind. Daily life revolved around this bucket. Families used it after waking up, guests used it when visiting. Children were introduced to chamber pots at a young age, learning quickly that if you tipped it over, you were cleaning it up. And by cleaning, I mean wiping the floor with whatever cloth your mother handed you while she recited an angry medieval proverb about consequences. But the most surprising thing is how often chamber pots were emptied, and how often they weren't. In theory, a proper household emptied the pot every morning. In practice, life happened. Maybe the weather was bad, maybe the pot was only half full, the optimist's view. Maybe everyone was running late to work in the fields. Maybe the pot was accidentally kicked under the bed and temporarily forgotten. Whatever the reason, chamber pots could linger longer than anyone wanted to admit. Emptying the pot was its own daily ritual. In many homes, women or servants carried the pot to the nearest disposal point, which might be a designated backyard pit, a compost heap, or, if feeling rebellious or exceptionally irritated, the nearest gutter. Wealthier homes sometimes had interior chutes leading to cesspits, and let's be honest, even if the chute worked well, it was basically medieval house plumbing without any of the convenience and all of the horror. But who really did the emptying? Depending on the household structure, the task fell to servants, especially maids, who deserved hazard pay centuries before the concept existed. Children, because medieval parenting believed in building character through borderline traumatic chores. Wives, because gender roles liked to pretend men didn't know where the chamber pot was kept. Tenants or apprentices, who couldn't complain without losing their lodging. Or occasionally, the man of the house, if he woke up early, saw the pot and pretended sudden enthusiasm for helping out. This was rare, anthropologically rare. But here's where we reach the part no one mentions. The real horror wasn't the smell, it was the sound. Chamber pots weren't padded, they weren't discreet, they weren't designed for acoustic comfort. They were open ceramic bowls, which meant that whenever someone used one, everyone in the room, the next room, or anywhere within earshot became an unwilling audience to a performance they never bought tickets for. Medieval families lived in tight quarters, often sharing a single room. Privacy wasn't a concept, it was a fantasy. If someone used the chamber pot at night, the entire family heard the unmistakable plink, glug, splash, or oh no that was loud, sounds echoing through the darkness like a tiny, humiliating thunderstorm. Nothing woke a medieval household faster than the unmistakable acoustics of their uncle relieving himself in the corner. In inns or boarding houses, the soundscape grew even more tragic. Dozens of guests shared a small space, each with their own chamber pot. Nights were filled with snores, shifting bodies, creaking beds, and other noises. If you stayed at a medieval inn, you didn't just pay for lodging, you paid for a front-row ticket to humanity's least glamorous symphony. And remember, chamber pots weren't just used at night. In winter, when stepping outside felt like a personal betrayal, chamber pots became daytime heroes too. Guests might excuse themselves, walk behind a curtain, a symbolic gesture at best, and you'd hear everything anyway. Hosting someone for dinner meant accepting that at some point they would use your pot and pretend you didn't hear. Cleaning the chamber pot was another sensory challenge. Dumping the contents created splashes, splatters, and an internal monologue filled with regrets. Rinsing it required water, which wasn't always clean, and some elbow grease. If you used lye or ash to scrub it, the smell transformed from unpleasant to weaponized. And once clean, it went right back under the bed, a loyal little nightmare waiting for its next shift. But despite all of this, The sound, the smell, the awkwardness, chamber pots were essential. They made nighttime safer, mornings more manageable, and households more functional. Without them, every person would have had to stumble into the dark, hoping not to fall into a ditch, trip over a pig, or get ambushed by their neighbour's goose. The medieval world had a goose problem. In short, chamber pots weren't glamorous, but they were indispensable. They were the quiet backbone of medieval hygiene, except, of course, when they were being used. Then they were very, very loud. If there is one group in medieval society that absolutely earned a parade, a statue, and a lifetime supply of perfumed candles, it was the Gong farmers, the men whose job was to climb into cesspits and remove the human waste that medieval cities, castles, monasteries and inns produced with impressive enthusiasm. You can keep your knights and lords. These were the real heroes. They didn't wear shining armour. They wore whatever clothing they didn't mind, never smelling normal again. Let's begin with the basics. What exactly was a Gong farmer? The word Gong comes from an Old English term meaning going, which is a poetic, delicate way of saying human waste. A Gong farmer, therefore, was a professional cleaner of cesspits, the sunless caverns beneath medieval latrines, privies, and castle garderobes. If you've ever looked at a modern bathroom and thought, it needs deep cleaning, or imagine a place where hundreds of people contributed daily deposits and nothing was flushed away, ever. Now imagine being the person hired to go get it. Gong farmers typically worked at night, not because of their mysterious medieval rituals, but because the smell during the heat of the day could flatten a grown man. Also, medieval society preferred to keep its least glamorous labour hidden from daytime eyes. In the glorious moonlight, when most people were asleep and fewer noses were awake to complain, Gong farmers arrived with their tools and their courage, or desperation. Their equipment was simple, effective, and deeply tragic. Long-handled scoops for dredging up the top layers of waste buckets for transporting the contents to waiting carts, ropes to lower themselves into pits, ladders, which were less tools of the trade and more lifelines, thick boots, though nothing thick enough for what they faced, and occasionally torches because working in darkness sounded romantic until you remembered the setting. The cesspits they entered weren't gentle, shallow pools. These were deep, stone-lined chambers designed to hold years' worth of waste, soaking and fermenting like the world's worst stew. Entering one meant climbing down into a warm, humid cavern of smell so potent that modern scientists would need hazard suits. Gong farmers inhaled this with no protection except sheer willpower, and the knowledge that if they passed out, absolutely no one wanted to climb down and retrieve them. The dangers were endless. A Gong farmer could slip off a ladder coated in condensation and land in the sludge, faint from fumes, which were powerful enough to knock out whole animals, become trapped if the rope failed, fall into soft pockets of waste like quicksand, but emotionally worse, hit pockets of methane, which could ignite from a torch and turn a normal shift into a medieval fireball, or the most dreaded fate, sink too deep, becoming a martyr to sanitation, remembered only as the man who drowned in everyone's Tuesday decisions. The job required strength, precision, and an iron stomach. Yet, believe it or not, Gong farmers were well paid, especially compared to other labourers. The work was horrible, which meant fewer applicants, which meant more money. A skilled Gong farmer could earn more in a night than a field labourer earned in a week. But before you imagine them living glamorous lives, remember that. They smelled like their job, all the time. People treated them like the human embodiment of an unfortunate smell. Many were banned from living inside city limits because no one wanted them walking past their homes. So while they earned money, they also lost the right to blend into society. Medieval deodorants and perfumes weren't powerful enough to erase the evidence of their labour. A Gong farmer didn't enter a room. He announced it involuntarily, several seconds before crossing the threshold. Let's take a moment to reflect on just how essential they were. Medieval towns produced staggering amounts of waste. Hundreds of people using latrines daily meant cesspits filled fast. Without cleaning, they would overflow into streets, yards, or cellars. And trust me, when waste has nowhere to go, it becomes highly creative. Overflowing pits could contaminate wells, spread disease, and turn neighbourhoods into uninhabitable zones of despair. Gong farmers prevented that. They kept towns livable, they kept disease at bay, they kept medieval communities functioning. Castle Gong farmers had an especially daunting task. Castle guardrobes often emptied into deep pits built into the walls or down sheer drops into enclosed chambers where waste collected for years. Cleaning these meant navigating narrow shafts, crawling through stone tunnels, and risking encounters with rats who had absolutely no respect for personal space. A Castle Gong farmer deserved knighthood simply for showing up. What happened to the waste after it was collected? It depended on the region. Sometimes it was carted outside the town and dumped in designated fields. Sometimes farmers bought it as fertiliser, with questionable enthusiasm. Sometimes it went into large open pits where it continued to age like a cursed wine. And sometimes rivers received the special delivery. Transporting it was nearly as dangerous as collecting it. Carts had to be covered to avoid attracting swarms of insects or, worse, spilling onto the road, which was an instant public tragedy. The strangest part. Despite everything, Gong farmers often took pride in their work. They knew society needed them. They understood the importance of their job, and while they weren't celebrated, they were indispensable. Without their labour, medieval towns would have been unlivable mazes of filth. So here's the truth. Knights protected kingdoms, lords ruled estates, but Gong farmers, they kept civilization from sinking literally into chaos. Medieval society may not have given them crowns, but history should. After all, anyone who willingly descended into humanity's worst leftovers and lived to tell the tale deserves royal recognition. If you have ever complained about modern traffic, potholes, or that one person who never picks up after their dog, medieval city streets are here to gently pat you on the shoulder and say, "Sweetheart, you have no idea." Because in the Middle Ages, the streets weren't just dirty, they were alive, moving, shifting, drifting. They were open sewers in the most literal sense, carrying with them the hopes, dreams, trash, produce scraps, and bodily regrets of the entire population. To understand medieval street life, imagine a long, narrow corridor between cramped timber houses. Now picture that corridor filled with mud, except the mud is 70% wishful thinking and 30% things we do not discuss at the dinner table. The roads were packed with people, animals, carts, vendors, and smells that could take on physical form and punch you. But the real danger wasn't the crowds, it was the flow. Medieval streets were constructed with a central dip, a gutter channel running right down the middle. The idea was brilliant in theory. Rainwater would wash debris away, keeping the road somewhat clear. In reality, the gutter simply became a sludge river. Anything that didn't belong indoors, food scraps, straw, rotting vegetables, milk gone bad, fish parts, feathers, and more unpleasant offerings, found its way into the gutter. Rain didn't clean the streets, it just stirred the pot. And then there was the waste. Households regularly dumped their chamber pots and kitchen refuse out their upper windows. But because this isn't chapter 4 anymore, we'll avoid repeating what exactly was poured and instead say this. Whatever was inside the pot, the bucket, or the tub joined the river of destiny below. A courteous warning, a shouted heads, or look out, might be offered before tossing, but medieval courtesy was inconsistent. Many pedestrians simply learned to develop the reflexes of a trained acrobat. You never walked close to the houses unless you were brave, foolish, or very late to work. The combination of animal traffic made things worse. Horses pulled carts through town, cows wandered freely, pigs rooted around for scraps, chickens strutted through the chaos, and dogs did whatever dogs felt like. Every creature added its own contribution to the general scent profile of the street. The result was a constantly renewing tapestry of substances that made every footstep a small gamble. This leads us to an important truth. Walking was a full-body sport. Your shoes, always filthy, your hemline permanently stained, your ankles, one slip away from rethinking your life choices. People walked carefully, strategically, using the higher edges of the street or balancing on stepping stones placed by city officials. After heavy rain, the centre gutter transformed from sludge to torrent, sweeping debris down the street with all the dignity of a medieval smoothie. On windy days, the spray could reach spectators, reminding everyone that the Middle Ages were as unforgiving as they were fragrant. Of course, someone had to manage this mess, and that someone was the raker, a municipal worker whose job was to collect, scrape, shovel and transport the street muck to designated dumping grounds outside town. Rakers didn't enter cesspits like Gong farmers did, but their profession was still an exercise in perseverance and questionable career choices. Armed with rakes, shovels and carts, they navigated streets ankle-deep in grime, scraping the worst of the build-up into manageable piles. Rakers worked at dawn or dusk, when streets were less crowded and the sun hadn't yet heated the sludge into an airborne experience. They were city employees, which sounds prestigious until you remember that their workday involved fighting tide after tide of substances that refused to be named. They had to manoeuvre around vendors, barking dogs, and indignant residents while gathering the city's collective leftovers, and no one ever thanked them. In fact, people often complained loudly if rakers accidentally left small piles behind or didn't clear a favourite walkway. Why didn't medieval cities just enforce better street cleanliness? The answer lies in one beautiful phrase: the filth tax. Some towns charged residents a regular fee to help pay for street cleaning services. Sounds modern, right? Except the tax was often resented, underpaid, dodged, or argued about. Many households claimed their waste wasn't that bad or insisted their section of street wasn't dirty enough to warrant payment. Others loudly accused neighbours of producing unreasonable filth, proof that passive-aggressive complaints about neighbourhood cleanliness are eternal. Cities relied on these taxes to fund rakers and dumping carts, but the system was always strained. A bad harvest, a local festival, or a single over-enthusiastic butcher could create enough street build-up to overwhelm an entire cleaning crew. And because waste management was inconsistent, so were the streets. Some days weren't too bad, just muddy, smelly, and full of questionable puddles. Other days looked like the aftermath of a food fight between a tavern, a butcher shop and a barnyard. Some wealthy towns tried to solve the problem by paving their streets, but paving didn't eliminate waste, it just made it more noticeable. Stone simply transformed the street into a slick surface where you slipped faster, fell harder and regretted everything more intensely. And yet, people adapted. Medieval city dwellers learned to walk on the balls of their feet, hop across dry patches, and instinctively dodge falling refuse from above. Children played games on the edge of the street, careful to avoid the gutter. Vendors laid straw to soak up spills. Travellers learned that the first thing to do upon entering a city wasn't sightseeing, it was checking your shoes to estimate how dangerous the streets were going to be. In short, medieval streets were less roads and more outdoor obstacle courses, where the prize for surviving a walk to the market was arriving only moderately stained. Nothing captures the medieval street experience better than this. You could leave your home clean. You would not return that way. The road decided. If you've ever felt nervous about going to the dentist, medieval Europe is here to pat you on the shoulder and whisper, "Relax, it could be worse, much worse." Because in the Middle Ages, dental care wasn't a medical specialty. It was a combination of superstition, bravery, improvisation, and a level of pain tolerance that modern humans simply don't possess. This was an era where toothaches were treated with prayers, pliers, potions, and pure guesswork, where cavities were described as toothworms, and the solution to many dental problems was yank it out and hope the screaming stops. Let's begin with the root of the problem, teeth themselves. Medieval diets were not gentle on human mouths. People ate coarse bread full of grit from millstones, tough meats, dried beans, and vegetables that required the chewing power of a determined squirrel. Sugar was rare but incredibly destructive when available, especially among wealthy elites who could afford sweets imported from afar. Combine all this with a lack of consistent tooth cleaning methods, and the result was a mouthful of dental disasters. Rotten teeth were common, expected, and sometimes even accepted as a natural part of adulthood, like wrinkles or existential dread. When a toothache struck, people tried everything before resorting to extraction, because even medieval citizens knew that losing a tooth meant losing a friend that, however flawed, was at least attached to your skull. So they tried herbal remedies, many of which had the subtle charm of chewing on someone's garden. Common numbing ingredients included clove oil, useful but rare and expensive henbane, numbing but halfway to hallucinogenic, mint and sage, refreshing but also basically mint and sage, marjoram, pepper or onion poultices, effective only at making you smell like dinner. Some remedies were infused with alcohol. Others involved smoking herbs through reed pipes. A few required reciting charms or wearing amulets shaped like teeth. One wildly creative cure advised holding a frog in the mouth until the pain transferred into the frog, leaving your toothache behind and probably giving the frog a horrible night. When none of these worked, and let's be honest, they mostly didn't, the next step was to seek out a tooth puller. Now, medieval tooth pullers were not dentists. Dentists did not exist. The job typically fell to blacksmiths because they already owned strong metal tools barber surgeons, whose qualifications included cutting hair and performing minor surgeries in the same chair. Travelling practitioners, who moved from town to town selling questionable ointments. Market pullers, who set up in public squares where, horrifyingly, the extractions were done in front of an audience. Yes, in the medieval world, getting a tooth pulled was a spectator event. People gathered around like it was street theatre. The tooth puller would hold up the tool of the day, pliers, forceps, or a terrifying hook known as an elevator. Say a few reassuring words that didn't reassure anyone, and then pull the tooth with the strength of someone cranking a medieval winch. The anesthetic was a cup of strong wine, 1 cup for numbness, 2 cups for courage. A prayer, a friend to hold you down, or most commonly, nothing at all. Tooth pullers often work quickly, partially because speed reduced suffering, and partially because the crowd grew restless if the extraction took too long. If the tooth broke, and medieval teeth often broke, the puller went back in with hooks and picks, fishing out fragments like a dentist meets fisherman nightmare. Some fortune tellers claimed they could identify your future spouse by examining your extracted molar. Others displayed pulled teeth as proof of their skill, hanging them around their stalls like morbid confetti. The entire process was loud, dramatic, and traumatizing enough to make you wonder whether the toothache had actually been that bad after all. Of course, not every medieval attempt at dental care involved bloodshed. People genuinely tried to keep their mouths somewhat clean. Which brings us to DIY medieval mouthwashes. Mixtures so strong, so acidic, and so questionable that modern chemists would need to approach them with gloves. Common recipes included vinegar mixed with herbs, wine infused with salt, brine solutions, urine, because medieval people truly believed urine could fix anything, crushed charcoal mixed with water, vinegar and brine combinations so corrosive they could double as rusty nail remover. These rinses could kill some bacteria, but they could also kill your taste buds, your enamel, and your faith in humanity. Many mouthwashes were so harsh they left gums raw and teeth more sensitive than ever. But medieval people weren't deterred. If a rinse burned your mouth, that meant it was working. Tooth cleaning tools existed too. We used chew sticks made of aromatic wood. Others rubbed teeth with linen cloths. The wealthy sometimes owned early forms of toothbrushes, though the bristles were stiff enough to scrape both plaque and hope. Tooth powders, the ancestors of toothpaste, were popular as well. They were usually made of crushed shells, burnt animal bones, ground herbs, salt, and whatever else someone thought might help. Many powders whitened teeth by grinding the enamel down until the surface became smoother. Effective, yes. Healthy, not remotely. When all else failed, people resorted to supernatural solutions. Cavities were believed by some to be caused by tooth worms, tiny creatures burrowing inside the tooth and causing pain. A few medieval texts describe remedies designed to lure the worms out, like breathing steam from heated herbs or applying oils believed to smoke the worm out. No worms ever emerged, but the determination was admirable. Despite the chaos, medieval dentistry was rooted in the same thing that drives dentistry today: the desperate human desire to stop a tooth from ruining your entire week. For medieval people, dental relief, then however brief, was worth the pain, the cost, and the risk. And that's the irony. Medieval dentistry hurt because it was trying to help. If you have ever had a bad hair day and thought, ugh, my hair looks medieval, you were more right than you knew. Hair care in the Middle Ages wasn't a relaxing self-care ritual. It was more like an ongoing diplomatic negotiation between you, your scalp, the weather, the lack of soap, and the entire insect kingdom. Medieval hair didn't just sit on your head, it lived there, with hopes, dreams, and possibly roommates. Let's begin with the central struggle. No shampoo. Well, not in the modern sense. No lavender-scented bottles, no anti-dandruff formulas, no salon-style lather. Medieval people cleaned their hair with whatever was available. Warm water, herbal rinses, animal fats, fermented concoctions, or absolutely nothing. Washing hair was rare because heating enough water was a chore, and comfortable temperature was a luxury reserved for royal babies and optimistic poets. Most people washed their hair only a handful of times a month, sometimes less. After all, water was cold, weather was cold, houses were cold, and hypothermia was a very real consequence of trying to look presentable. You didn't wash your hair for vanity. You washed it because you felt like a candle whose wax was starting to drip. That brings us to medieval hair grease, which was not a scandal. It was expected. Hair naturally accumulated oils, smoke from hearth fires, airborne debris, cooking scents, and whatever pollen the wind felt like sharing. Medieval citizens described hair as glossy, sleek, or well-oiled, because saying greasy enough to fry lunch on was considered rude. A shiny head was often a healthy head, and a bit of sheen meant your scalp wasn't freezing off in winter. When the grease became too much, when your hair stuck together like medieval Velcro, people used early forms of dry shampoo. And by early forms, I mean ingredients that belonged in gardens, fireplaces, or confessionals. Flower ashes, chalk dust, and powdered herbs were rubbed into the hair to soak up oil. It kind of worked, if your standards were low enough, but it came with side effects. Flour made you look like a baker sneezed on your head. Ashes made your hair smell like a recently used fireplace. Chalk dust made darker hair appear prematurely haunted. And herbs attracted insects who mistook your scalp for a salad bar. Still, medieval dry shampoo remained popular because the alternative was washing your hair with a lye soap, effective but harsh enough to dissolve both grime and self-esteem. Lye stripped oil so aggressively it left hair feeling like wool that had been overcooked. Only the wealthy used imported soaps with gentler ingredients, and even those felt medieval in spirit. But nothing complicates the story more than the resident pests. Lice. Lice were the medieval roommates no one invited, but everyone had. Clean hair, dirty hair, long hair, short hair, lice did not discriminate. They thrived in crowded households and communal sleeping arrangements, and in societies where personal space was a rumour. If you had hair, you had lice, and if you said you didn't, you were lying or scratching off camera. To deal with lice, medieval people used fine-toothed combs made of bone or wood, herbal rinses of rosemary, wormwood, lavender, or vinegar. Head coverings, which hid the problem, but definitely didn't solve it. Boiling, clothing and bedding, a method that required a pot big enough and emotional readiness. Services of night pickers, often family members who sat behind you and searched your scalp like archaeologists finding ancient ruins. Children were particularly vulnerable, and mothers spent long evenings combing through hair while muttering prayers, curses, or both. Comb findings were sometimes tossed into the fire with great satisfaction, as if sending lice to their fiery judgment made up for the hours spent battling them. Then there was dandruff, the eternal snowstorm of the scalp. Medieval explanations range from cold humours to dry brain vapours, a concept I deeply wish were a joke. Treatments included olive oil, vinegar, nettle water rinses, and vigorous brushing with wooden combs. Some people wore linen caps at night to soften the scalp, though the caps mostly served as tiny prisons for falling flakes. Hair care differed across social classes. Peasants wore their hair long or braided and relied on simple grooming routines. Their hair collected soot from fires, dust from fields, and smoke from daily labour. Washing was occasional, combing was constant. Nobles, especially women, treated hair as a sign of beauty and status. They used scented oils, rose, myrtle, or almond, elaborate braids, ribbons, and decorative nets. Noble women washed their hair more often, but they also styled it heavily, which meant their scalps waged a constant war against hairpins, gels made from plant resins, and overpriced medieval accessories clearly designed to sabotage comfort. Men approached hair with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some noblemen sported shoulder-length curls styled using hot irons, medieval curling irons heated in fireplaces, which introduced the exciting possibility of burning off both hair and eyebrows. Others kept their hair cropped short to avoid lice, dandruff, and the emotional commitment of grooming. Beards deserved their own tragic category. Men cleaned them with the same techniques as scalp hair, but beards collected food particles the way libraries collect dust, constantly and without apology. Combing out a medieval beard was less about vanity and more about preventing your facial hair from developing its own biodiversity. Despite all the challenges, the grease, the insects, the smell, the risk of being mistaken for a roadside haystack, medieval hair care wasn't neglect, it was survival. People managed with what they had, making do with herbs, combs, ashes, and a generous helping of hope. And here's the twist. When fully braided, oiled with herbs and scented with flowers, medieval hair could be stunning. Underneath the trials of hygiene was creativity, pride, and ingenuity. Medieval hair wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Wild, practical, stubborn, and possibly hosting 3 generations of lice. If you think today's biggest household nuisance is the occasional fruit fly, or the neighbour's cat staring at you through the window, medieval Europe invites you to sit down carefully and reconsider. Because in the Middle Ages, your real roommates weren't your family members, your spouse, or even that one cousin who never moved out. No, your true companions were lice, fleas, and bedbugs, a persistent trio that turned every household into an involuntary wildlife sanctuary. Let's begin with a brutal truth. Everyone had parasites. Rich, poor, noble, peasant, monk, merchant. None were safe. Hygiene practices weren't strong enough, homes weren't clean enough, and clothing wasn't washed often enough to stop the invasion. Even royalty couldn't escape the itch. Medieval parasites didn't respect class boundaries. They were equal opportunity nuisances. If you had skin, hair, blood, or a warm place to sleep, congratulations, you were eligible for a thriving personal ecosystem. Lice, the undefeated champions of medieval life. Head lice were by far the most common. They moved easily from person to person, thriving in crowded towns, busy marketplaces, shared bedding, communal workspaces, and households where everyone slept close together for warmth. They didn't care if you were poor or wealthy. They only cared that your blood tasted like breakfast. Where did lice hide? Everywhere. In your hair, in the seams of clothing, in hats, in bedding, in blankets, in furs, even in religious garments that were supposed to symbolize purity. Medieval people occasionally shaved their heads to fight infestation. Monks, for instance, had their famous tonsures not just for spirituality, but because lice enjoyed the warmth beneath a full head of hair. Picking lice off one another was so common that it became a bonding activity, the medieval version of spa day. Mothers combed through children's hair with measured patience. Lovers picked nits from each other's scalps with unsettling affection. Friends chatted while plucking insects as casually as we scroll on our phones. It wasn't gross. It was social grooming. Humanity won. Parasites also won, because they kept coming back. And then there were body lice who didn't even pretend to be subtle. They lived in clothing, burrowing into seams and folds like tiny, uninvited tenants. People cleansed themselves. But their clothing was another story. Washing garments was so difficult and time-consuming that outer clothes might go weeks or months without a proper cleaning. Body lice flourished in this paradise, multiplying with the enthusiasm of medieval rabbits. Fleas, the itchy acrobatics experts. If lice were the persistent roommates, fleas were the agents of chaos, tiny acrobatic vampires who could leap great distances and ruin your day faster than a bad omen. Fleas were everywhere animals were, which meant everywhere humans were. Medieval towns teemed with dogs, cats, pigs, goats, livestock, and rats, each carrying fleas with the dedication of loyal companions. Fleas didn't just bite, they invaded. They nested in bedding, in straw mattresses, in floor rushes, the plant stalks people used instead of carpets, and in clothing thrown over chairs. At night, they feasted on sleeping inhabitants, leaving legs, arms, and backs covered in itchy red welts. Waking up with a constellation of flea bites was normal. Complaining about it was pointless. Everyone else was itching too. Fleas spread quickly in cities because homes were close, animals wandered freely, and people visited each other's houses often. A flea living in the fur of a neighbour's dog might end up in your mattress the next day, a medieval version of "you brought this into my house?" And yes, fleas weren't just annoying, they were historical villains. Though this chapter won't retread plague details, it's worth noting that medieval people knew fleas were pests long before scientists discovered they were carriers of something far deadlier. To the average medieval citizen, fleas were simply exhausting. They bit, they jumped, they hid, and they multiplied. And getting rid of them was nearly impossible without boiling water, sun exposure, or divine intervention. Bedbugs, the nighttime menaces. If lice were annoying and fleas were exhausting, bedbugs were downright existential. Bedbugs, those ancient stubborn insects who have survived every century with the enthusiasm of creatures who refuse to go extinct, made medieval beds their kingdom. Wooden bed frames provided ideal hiding spots. Tiny cracks, joints, and carvings were perfect for colonies. Straw mattresses offered even more opportunities because straw absorbed moisture, body heat, crumbs, and sweat, which to bedbugs was the medieval equivalent of room service. These pests hid during the day, invisible, silent, smug. But at night, they emerged like tiny vampires feeding on sleepers and leaving itchy trails as proof of their night shift. Because bed linens weren't washed often and mattresses were rarely replaced, bedbugs thrived generation after generation. A single bed could host dozens, even hundreds of them, a living nightmare disguised as furniture. People tried many methods to fight them. Scalding water poured over the bed frames, beating mattresses outdoors to shake out pests, hanging bedding in sunlight helped, but only slightly, using herbs such as rue or tansy, believed to repel insects. Smoking the bed with burning herbs or coals, results were mixed, very mixed. Bedbugs are often returned with the confidence of tiny warriors who had seen death and decided it wasn't for them. Grooming as survival. When parasites are everywhere, grooming isn't cosmetic. It's tactical. Medieval grooming routines involved daily combing to remove lice, delousing clothing with hot stones or heated irons, checking bedding for bedbugs, picking fleas off one another, like medieval monkeys engaged in a social ritual. Cleaning clothing in boiling water when water was available, hanging garments near fireplaces to smoke out bugs or just smoke yourself into a stupor. Children learned early how to spot lice. Adults became experts in identifying bites. Entire households participated in parasite control like modern households participate in spring cleaning. Except spring cleaning rarely involves burning a mattress because it felt alive. But here's the strange part. Parasites weren't just tolerated, they were expected. Medieval people scratched openly in public, brushed insects from their clothing mid-conversation, and picked nits with casual pride. It was part of life, and no one pretended otherwise. Your family lived with you, your neighbours lived near you. But parasites? They lived on you, and in the Middle Ages, that was just the way things were. Before you picture medieval laundry as a peaceful scene of women humming by a river, with sunlight glinting off clean linen, let's correct the record. Medieval laundry was war. A war fought with wooden paddles, boiling cauldrons, aggressive soap, uncooperative weather, and clothing so filthy it could qualify as a semi-sentient being. Washing clothes wasn't a task. It was a campaign, something households scheduled the way we schedule root canals, reluctantly and with emotional preparation. Let's start with the most important fact. Medieval clothing took forever to wash. Not an afternoon, not a day. A week. A full, exhausting, morale-destroying week, especially for large households. Why laundry was rare, and when I say rare I mean almost festive. Because clothes were expensive, people owned very few garments. A working adult might have one main outfit, two if fortune smiled. That outfit endured daily sweat, smoke, dirt, work grime, spilled food, animal hair, soot, the mysterious dust that lived in every medieval home, and whatever else the environment offered. Clothing became dirty fast, smelled even faster, and slowly developed personality. By the time laundry day arrived, garments weren't just dirty, they were alive adjacent. Your shirt didn't need to walk away on its own, it simply had to look like it wanted to. The river, the original washing machine and public spectacle. Most laundry began at the nearest river, where washing stations or smooth stones served as medieval sinks. Laundry tools included wooden paddles for beating clothes into submission, washboard-like stones, huge wooden tubs, and hands already chapped from weeks of work. Clothes were soaked, beaten, scrubbed and rinsed repeatedly. The paddles weren't gentle. Beating the cloth helped remove dirt, yes, but also helped release stress, frustration, and the deeply held resentment that laundry required this much effort in the first place. Nearby villages often scheduled specific wash days, because dozens of people trying to wash laundry at once turned the riverbank into a chaotic festival of splashing water, loud voices, gossip, flying droplets, and the occasional accidental paddle to the elbow. Laundry wasn't private, it was communal. And your neighbours absolutely knew how filthy your clothing had become. Medieval life offered few secrets. Your laundry was not one of them. The magic and misery of lice soap water alone didn't cut it. Enter lye soap, the medieval cleaning product that worked beautifully at a price, and that price was usually your skin. Lye soap was made by mixing animal fat with water filtered through ashes. The result was a strong alkaline soap capable of cutting through stubborn dirt, grease, sweat, and, in extreme cases, happiness. Using it felt a bit like washing garments in melted, angry chalk. Clothes came out cleaner. Your hands came out questioning their life choices. Wealthier households sometimes used gentler soaps made with imported oils or herbs, but for the average person, lye soap was the budget-friendlier, skin-annihilating option of choice. Boiling, the medieval sterilisation technique, sort of. For linens, especially sheets, undergarments and children's clothing, boiling was a must. A huge cauldron was filled with water, sometimes mixed with lye, herbs, or urine. Yes, urine. It was valued for its ammonia content. And fabrics were submerged until the water looked like soup made by a villain. Boiling clothes did several things: removed deep-set dirt, killed certain insects, loosened oils, filled the home with steam, scented vaguely of despair. But boiling wasn't safe. Large cauldrons could tip, fires could flare, and carrying the heavy pot required strength, balance, and a prayer to every saint, even loosely associated with domestic tasks. Drying, the unpredictable finale. Drying clothes took patience and weather luck. Laundry was hung on bushes, ropes, hedges, fences, or spread on grass. If it rained, you started over. If wind knocked garments down, you washed them again. If animals wandered by, you guessed it, repeat the process. Birds also contributed their own commentary onto drying laundry. Medieval laundry workers did not have easy lives. The ecosystem problem. Because clothes were washed so infrequently, they accumulated sweat, natural oils, dirt, smoke particles, plant debris, flea droppings, parasite eggs, and sometimes full-blown insect communities. Your shirt didn't just sit in a chest, it developed interests. Clothing seams harboured body lice. Matted fibres offered cosy hideouts for fleas. Bed linens carried the faint memories of thousands of nights. Cloaks smelled like the last 10 meals you ate. Hats held onto the scent of every smoky hearth you ever passed. By laundry week, your clothing could have been granted land rights. Professional launderers, the medieval cleaning avengers. In towns, professional launderers existed, usually lower-class women who handled mountains of laundry for nobles, merchants, priests, and elderly households. Their work was incredibly physical. They carried loads, stirred boiling cauldrons, hauled soaking wet linens, which are approximately the weight of a baby mammoth, and scrubbed until their knuckles nearly disappeared. These women were essential workers, except instead of applause they received complaints about shrinking tunics. The smell factor. Freshly cleaned laundry smelled fine. Not floral, not fresh in the modern sense, just clean enough not to cause alarm. Because medieval cleanliness wasn't about fragrance, it was about survival. After weeks of wearing clothes infused with every scent the world had to offer, anything that resembled neutrality was amazing. But the smell of drying laundry mixed with smoke, dampness, and lye lingered. You didn't get that crisp, hung-in-the-sun scent. You got someone tried really hard. The psychological victory of laundry wasn't just a chore, it was a triumph. When a week-long battle with water, soap, weather, insects, and stubborn stains finally resulted in garments that were slightly lighter in colour and significantly less alive, you felt victorious. You survived the laundry survived you. Balance was restored. Medieval laundry didn't produce spotless garments. It produced garments that were wearable, less hazardous, more socially acceptable, and slightly less likely to crawl away on their own. And in the Middle Ages, that was enough. If medieval hygiene was a battlefield, then scent was the armour, thin, decorative, and not particularly good at stopping anything. But oh, did they try. They tried with herbs, flowers, scented oils, powdered resins, burning incense, aromatic wood chips, and mixtures so strong they could stun a goat at 20 paces, because when bathing was optional, laundry was an odyssey, and parasites were unofficial roommates, people turned to perfume the way a modern person turns to Wi-Fi, desperately and often. Let's begin with the most iconic medieval scent accessory, the pomander. A pomander was a small, beautifully crafted container, often silver or gold, filled with aromatic ingredients. Think of it as a medieval air freshener, except instead of hanging from your rearview mirror, you wore it proudly on your belt, around your neck, or tucked into your clothing like a tiny, fragrant lifeline. Inside these pomanders were mixtures designed to wage war against the nose. The most common ingredients included crushed rose petals, lavender cloves, cinnamon, frankincense, myrrh, juniper berries, musk, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges because desperate times. These weren't subtle fragrances. These scents marched into your nostrils with determination. They weren't trying to gently complement your natural aroma. They were trying to bury it in an unmarked grave. Their purpose was twofold: cover the ambient medieval stench, which hovered constantly like a haunted cloud, protect the wearer from bad air, believed to cause illness through miasma. The concept that foul odours were directly responsible for disease. Pomanders weren't just accessories, they were health strategies. Wearing one was the medieval equivalent of carrying hand sanitizer, essential oils, and an emotional support candle all at once. Herbal pouches, medieval pocket potpourri. For those without access to silver pomanders or exotic imported spices, there were humbler alternatives, little cloth bags stuffed with herbs. These scent pouches were sewn from linen scraps and filled with whatever aromatic plants grew nearby: rosemary, sage, mint, thyme, chamomile, or dried flowers. People hung them inside clothing, tied them to belts, or tucked them into sleeves like secret weapons. These pouches were especially popular among the lower classes because they were cheap, customizable, and easy to hide if someone teased you for smelling too nice. Yes, people were mocked for being excessively fragrant, especially if their scent was suspiciously expensive. Medieval life was complicated. Perfumed gloves, clothes, and hair. The wealthy didn't stop at pomanders, they elevated the art of smelling acceptable to a full-blown lifestyle. Enter perfumed clothing. Some noble garments were soaked in scented waters or sprinkled with fragrant powders. Gloves especially were saturated with floral oils so heavily that wearing them was like shaking hands with a garden. Gloves perfumed with ambergris, a substance produced in the digestive system of whales, were a status symbol among royalty. Yes, medieval nobles paid a fortune to smell like luxury whale. Hair, too, was often scented. Without modern shampoos or conditioners, noblemen and noblewomen used oils infused with rose, sage, violet, or citrus. These scents didn't just mask odour, they made hair shine, which created the illusion of cleanliness. The same way a polished shoe can hide the fact that you sprinted through a puddle 5 minutes earlier. Incense, the medieval room. Deodorizer. Forget scented candles. Medieval homes used incense, and they used it enthusiastically. Churches burned it to purify the air and the soul. Nobles burned it to disguise the scent of unwashed rooms, and towns burned it during outbreaks of disease because everyone believed that good smells were health-preserving. Common incense ingredients included resin from pine, fir, or frankincense trees, herbs like rosemary or thyme, dried citrus peels, wood chips soaked in scented oils, juniper, which smoked aggressively like a disgruntled guardian spirit. Incense made rooms smell better for about 10 minutes. After that, the underlying scent of damp wool, stale air, old rushes on the floor, and life happening loudly in one room returned with a vengeance. Perfumes, medieval luxury in bottles. True perfume making was an elite craft. Imported ingredients, complex distillation methods, and artistic bottles made perfumes status symbols. The wealthy stored them in carved boxes, glass vials, or ornate containers imported from the Middle East or Italy, where perfuming techniques were far more advanced. Popular scents included rosewater orange blossom, jasmine, violet musk, ambergris civet. Taken from the glands of a small mammal, medieval luxury was not for the faint of heart. These perfumes were strong, expensive, and unapologetically bold. You didn't spritz them, you announced them. When a noblewoman entered a hall wearing imported jasmine oil, her scent preceded her like an introduction. People knew she had arrived several seconds before she physically walked in. But perfumes weren't purely for attractiveness. Many believed that smelling good helped preserve health, protect against foul air, and guard the body from invisible enemies. Medieval citizens didn't fight germs, they fought odours. It was the wrong battle, but they fought it valiantly. Public effort to fight smell, the nose war continues. Cities sometimes attempted communal scent improvement initiatives. Streets were sprinkled with herbs during festivals or major events. Churches incorporated fragrant flowers into processions. Even homes occasionally scattered aromatic branches on the floor to freshen the air and to combat the scent of whatever was slowly composting beneath the floor rushes. Did these efforts work? Temporarily. Did people keep trying? Absolutely. Because medieval scent culture wasn't about achieving freshness. It was about maintaining hope. Medieval smell philosophy, yes, there was one. Because miasma theory ruled medical beliefs, good smells symbolized health, virtue, purity and refinement. Bad smells symbolized decay, illness, moral weakness, and poor fortune. This wasn't just deodorizing, it was a world view. To medieval people, smelling good meant you were spiritually aligned. Smelling bad meant something was wrong, physically or morally. A perfume wasn't superficial, it was protective and symbolic. They weren't covering up dirt, they were fending off danger. The final truth, medieval perfumes and pomanders weren't just about disguising the fact that bathing wasn't a priority. They were attempts at transforming daily life into something tolerable, even pleasant. They were tiny luxuries in a world of powerful smells, cramped living spaces, and environmental challenges. They weren't trying to smell clean, they were trying to smell hopeful. If you've ever walked into a questionable gas station bathroom and thought, this is the worst humanity has to offer, medieval Europe taps you on the shoulder and says, oh, sweet summer child, sit down if you dare and let's talk. Because medieval public toilets weren't just unpleasant, they were architectural warnings. These restrooms were so risky, so communal, and so aggressively unprivate that calling them restrooms is an insult to the word rest. Let's begin with the hallmark of medieval sanitation, communal latrines. Communal latrines, the medieval social experience nobody wanted. In monasteries, castles, taverns and urban quarters, latrines weren't quaint little stalls with doors and polite gaps under them. They were long stone or wooden benches with multiple holes lined up side by side like the world's worst choir arrangement. Privacy screens? No. Partitions? Absolutely not. Emotional comfort? A fantasy. You simply sat next to your neighbour, did your business, and either ignored each other with monk-like concentration or made small talk to ease the existential despair. In some monasteries, the latrine could seat 10-20 monks at once. It was quiet, yes, but only because no one had the courage to break the silence. In larger establishments, the waste dropped into long trough-like pits beneath the seating area. These pits weren't cleaned often, but let's not revisit the professional cleaners from a previous chapter. What matters here is that communal latrines were open, echoing, breezy chambers where every sound carried like a tragic medieval symphony. And then there were the smells. If you've ever walked into a room and immediately regretted it, imagine that feeling multiplied by 20 with acoustics. Riverside loos, scenic. Until you look down, many towns and ports built toilet structures directly over rivers. These were small wooden outposts perched on stilts or beams, with openings that let waste fall straight into the water. To the medieval mind, this was brilliant engineering. Why build a pit when nature can carry away the problem? To the people downstream, not so brilliant. These riverside loos were used by fishermen, travellers, merchants, and absolutely anyone passing by. Some were communal boxes with several holes inside, meaning you could enjoy the sounds of the water, the city, the passing boats, and the person 2 holes over trying to finish quickly before the whole structure creaked too hard. The worst part wasn't the smell, it was the splashback risk, because the river moved. And when the water hit the underside of the toilet structure just right, medieval physics delivered a surprise nobody wanted. And yes, people working on boats sometimes rowed too close, glancing upward at the exact wrong moment. Maritime life was risky in many ways. Floating waste, the uninvited companion. Because riverside toilets emptied straight into flowing water, medieval waterways were filled with floating debris. Fishermen sometimes joked that they didn't know what they caught until they reeled it in, and often regretted checking. Urban dwellers living near riverbanks had to deal with waste drifting past their homes. Children threw stones into the water and accidentally aimed at the wrong targets. Dogs chased river debris with the kind of enthusiasm that made owners deeply uncomfortable. And woe to anyone upstream who dumped their chamber pot into the river, just as someone downstream leaned over to fill a bucket. Medieval life was many things, but predictable was not one of them. Mixed-gender facilities, because privacy was a luxury. Modern bathrooms separate men and women. Medieval bathrooms separated absolutely nothing. At inns, markets, and public squares, public toilets were used by anyone who needed them. Men, women, children, travellers, merchants, workers. Partitions were rare. Doors were even rarer. Sometimes there were curtains, but they flapped in the wind like embarrassed flags. This meant that using a toilet was a community activity, whether you subscribed to the idea or not. People walked in and out freely, sometimes mid-conversation. Privacy wasn't expected, so it wasn't protected. In many places, women lifted long skirts and managed their clothing with impressive dexterity, while maintaining as much dignity as the setting allowed, which, frankly, was not a lot. The soundtrack of medieval toileting. If Chapter 4 taught us that chamber pots were acoustically aggressive, then medieval public toilets were full orchestras. The echoing stone, the hollow pits, the running water under riverside loos, every noise was amplified. Conversations, shifting sighs, plops, drips, echoes, all of it combined into a daily soundscape that medieval people pretended not to notice. Travellers from other regions sometimes wrote about these public latrines with a mixture of awe and trauma, as if describing a mythical beast. Structural hazards, when toilets turned against you. Perhaps the most shocking reality of medieval public toilets is how often they collapsed. Wooden structures over rivers rotted, support beams cracked, stone latrine walls crumbled. People fell into cesspits more times than history politely records. Chronicles mention towns where repair crews had to rescue individuals who were overcome by foul air, or who experienced sudden descent during use. This was diplomatic medieval phrasing for the floor gave out and everything became a nightmare. Some unlucky users fell into river currents while using riverside loos, an accident that combined public humiliation with an impromptu swimming lesson. Urban waste trenches, for when toilets were too fancy. Not all towns had official public toilets. Many simply had waste trenches, shallow ditches along markets or alleyways where people relieved themselves when urgent. These trenches were sometimes lined with straw to absorb liquid, though absorb might be too optimistic a word. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't sanitary, but it was available, which in the medieval world counted as a win. The social psychology of zero privacy. For us, privacy is a fundamental expectation. For medieval people, it was decoration. People lived, worked, ate, slept, washed, birthed children, and relieved themselves near other humans, often within the touching distance. Privacy wasn't a right. It was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even then, only sometimes. Public toilets were simply an extension of communal life. No one expected solitude, no one expected locked doors, and no one expected silence or cleanliness. They just expected a place to go, and most days that was enough. If you think modern feet have a hard life, squeezed into shoes, judged for dryness, occasionally trodden on, medieval feet would like a word. Actually, they'd like a long scream, because in the Middle Ages, your feet weren't just overlooked. They were treated as optional maintenance projects, vaguely acknowledged in theory but rarely addressed in practice. Medieval foot hygiene wasn't a routine, it was a gamble, and most people lost. Let's start with the basics. Feet mattered, but only sometimes, and usually only when social pressure forced people to acknowledge them. Medieval living involved hours of standing, walking on uneven roads, working in fields, trudging through town muck, and wearing shoes that can best be described as fabric with ambitions. By day's end, feet weren't just dirty. They were tired, scraped, blistered, and radiating a smell that could register as a medieval weapon. Communal basins. Foot cleaning or foot contamination. In households lucky enough to have any kind of washing station, foot care often meant using a shared basin. A humble wooden or ceramic bowl filled with water that had already been used by at least one other pair of feet and had opinions about it. Communal foot basins were the medieval equivalent of sharing a bath with your extended family, except the focus was feet, and the water situation was significantly more distressing. A typical evening routine went like this. Someone filled a basin with warmish water. The first person washed their feet. The second person pretended not to notice the water turning cloudy. The third person questioned their life choices. By the fourth or fifth person, the basin was less water and more soup of sorrow. People tolerated this because water was limited and heating it required effort. Unless you were wealthy, you didn't get fresh foot water every time. Individual water privileges were reserved for babies, the sick, and individuals who had irritated their spouses enough to be sent out to wash alone. Feet washing as hospitality, a ritual of respect and bravery. Surprisingly, foot washing was also a respected ritual in some contexts. In inns, monasteries, and religious gatherings, hosts offered travellers the chance to clean their feet as a gesture of kindness. The idea was noble. Travellers walked long distances. Their feet needed relief. The execution, let's call it emotionally challenging. Imagine a monk kneeling to wash the feet of a pilgrim who had just walked through forests, over muddy paths, through towns full of ankle-deep muck, and possibly even across farmland full of surprises left behind by livestock. The act was humbling, symbolic, and deeply courageous. Foot washing became a spiritual reflection of humility, though, if we're being honest, it probably also tested faith in ways no scripture described. Religious foot washing, symbolic purity meets practical horror. Foot washing ceremonies existed throughout Christianity, especially during Holy Week. Church leaders washed the feet of congregants, symbolizing service and humility. These ceremonies were often deeply moving, though the participants never wrote in detail what the smell situation was like. Medieval modesty had limits. The ritual reinforced the idea that caring for feet was sacred work. But, as in many medieval things, symbolic practice didn't always lead to daily hygiene. People gladly had their feet washed during ceremonies but didn't feel obligated to replicate the experience at home. Shoes. The silent saboteurs. Medieval shoes were present. That's the nicest possible description. Most were made of untreated leather, stitched together without cushioning, insoles, or arch support. They kept your feet covered, yes, but they didn't protect them from moisture, cold, heat, terrain, or emotional damage. Shoes let water in, let mud in, let gravel in, let everything in. They had the structural integrity of soggy cardboard and the support of a friend who keeps saying, "You'll be fine," when you're clearly not fine. As a result, medieval feet were frequently soaked, dirty, bruised and injured, and because people didn't always wash them, well, things happened. Fungal infections, the uninvited residents. Today we call it athlete's foot. Medieval people called it the rot, the itch, the creeping heat, the curse of damp boots. Whatever the name, fungal infections were incredibly common. Enclosed, sweaty shoes, reused stockings, damp wool, communal working conditions, and rare foot washing meant fungi experienced their own renaissance. Symptoms included itching, peeling skin cracks between toes, a burning sensation, and an aroma described in some texts as disturbing to God and man alike. Treatments range from herbal salves to vinegar washes to letting your feet air by walking barefoot, which unfortunately introduced entirely new problems like stepping on rocks, thorns, livestock droppings, or emotional regrets. Calluses, corns, and blisters, medieval foot badges of honour. If you walked anywhere in the Middle Ages, and you did, everyone did, your feet developed. Thick calluses you could practically use as armour. Corns from ill-fitting boots, blisters from long treks, splinters from wooden floors and carts, cracks from dry winters, and cuts from whatever the road decided to throw at you that day. People accepted foot pain as part of daily life. Complaining about it was like complaining about the weather. Everyone knew, everyone suffered, and nobody could fix it. Royal and noble foot care. Clean-ish, but only when necessary. Royalty and nobles had the resources to wash their feet more often, and they had servants who could provide warmer water, oils, and cloths dedicated to foot care. But even nobles didn't wash their feet daily. Why? Because medieval hygiene views treated feet like a lower priority. Not embarrassing, not vital, just there. Foot washing was something nobles did. Before elaborate events, before religious ceremonies, before intimate encounters, or when shoes had betrayed them for too many hours, royal foot baths sometimes contained rosewater or aromatic herbs, making the experience luxurious. But the frequency was still modest, comfort over cleanliness. Medieval beliefs about feet. Philosophy meets denial. Many medieval people believed feet didn't need the same attention as the face or hands. After all, feet were always covered, meaning their problems stayed politely hidden. If something didn't smell too bad, it wasn't urgent, unless royalty was nearby. Then suddenly every foot was an emergency. It was a strange double standard. If you were home, feet, who cares? If a noble guest arrived, wash everything immediately, including your soul, and especially your feet. Feet became symbols of status. Clean feet meant respectability. Dirty feet meant ordinary life. The tragic, inevitable conclusion. Foot hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't about being clean. It was about coping. People did what they could with the water, tools, beliefs, and shared basins they had. But most of the time, medieval feet lived a hard life and smelled like it. If hands were the workers and faces were the social presentation, then feet were the forgotten heroes, quietly enduring every hardship thrown their way. And in the Middle Ages, heroes didn't always get washed. If you have ever stepped in something unpleasant while walking your dog and thought, "This is the worst part of urban life," medieval Europe would like to introduce you to an entire era of disappointment. Because in the Middle Ages, animal waste wasn't an occasional nuisance. It was the backbone of daily city life, a constant presence underfoot, around corners, drifting on the breeze, and greeting visitors long before the city gates came into view. Let's begin with the basic truth. Medieval towns were full of animals, not just pets, working animals, food animals, transport animals, wandering animals, and animals that simply woke up every morning and chose chaos. Cows, goats, pigs, sheep, geese, chickens, horses, donkeys, dogs, and every variation of stray creature lived intertwined with the human population. These animals weren't tucked away in neat barns or tidy fields. They roamed freely, shared roads, napped against houses, trotted through marketplaces, and left surprise messages across every inch of medieval ground. Horses, the daily producers of urban landmines. Horses were everywhere. In a world without cars, horses pulled carts, carried travellers, delivered goods, transported soldiers, and stood tied outside taverns like large judgmental lawn ornaments. And each horse produced around 35 pounds of manure a day, an amount medieval streets were absolutely not prepared for. Manure didn't just sit in the streets. It accumulated, broke down, spread, got trampled, mixed with mud, stuck to shoes, and worked its way into the permanent aroma of the city. Fresh piles steamed in winter like small unpleasant landmarks. Summer heat turned them into scent grenades. City officials tried to organise manure removal, but animal traffic was so constant and so prolific that any clean street stayed clean for approximately 5 minutes. Pigs, nature's garbage disposals, with opinions. Pigs roamed medieval cities with the confidence of creatures who knew they owned the place. Why? Because they kind of did. Towns kept pigs to eat, refuse, spoiled vegetables, kitchen scraps, rotten fruits, fallen grain, failed cooking experiments, whatever. Pigs were walking recycling systems, munching on everything except civic responsibility. And pigs produced droppings with such enthusiasm that entire streets became swine-scented obstacle courses. Their waste rolled downhill when it rained, forming little pig-dropping rivers that politely escorted you from one part of town to another, whether you wanted the tour or not. Some towns outlawed free-roaming pigs because they knocked over children, destroyed gardens, and deposited ruin everywhere. Other towns shrugged and said, "The pigs stay. They're doing their best." Cows, sheep, and goats, the herd that now lived downtown, Many homes kept livestock nearby. Milk cows grazed in open lots. Sheep were herded through town for shearing or market days. Goats wandered freely, chewing on anything that looked vaguely edible. Stray laundry, thatch, rope, cartwheels, your cloak if you weren't watching. Where they grazed, they left manure. Where they walked, they left manure. Where they paused to contemplate life, also manure. In many towns, the streets were a patchwork quilt of animal droppings, each species contributing its own texture, shape, and fragrance. Medieval people became experts in manure identification the same way modern people identify coffee brands, a sad but useful skill. Butcher waste, the bonus horrors. Now, let's add a new layer to the medieval street stew. Butcher waste. Butchers worked in open stalls, often right on the street. When they slaughtered animals, chickens, pigs, sheep, or even cattle, they disposed of the unusable parts somewhere nearby. This included blood, fat, bones, intestines, organs. Bits and pieces no one wanted to name. Some towns required butchers to dump these scraps outside city limits. Others didn't bother enforcing rules. The result was that butcher waste attracted flies, dogs, rats, and sometimes angry neighbours waving brooms. In summer, the smell hit with such force that travellers mentioned it in their journals. In winter, butcher waste froze into solid chunks that stayed in the street like dark, mysterious ice cubes. Geese and chickens, feathered chaos machines. Geese patrolled medieval streets like unpaid security guards. They honked, chased strangers, and pooped whenever and wherever they pleased. Chicken droppings dotted roads, courtyards, porches, and market squares, creating a cheerful and slippery mosaic of avian contributions. Chickens also dust-bathed in piles of dirt or refuse, which stirred up debris and scattered it across the street. They were small, noisy agents of entropy. The smell, a warning from afar. Visitors approaching medieval towns often smelled them before they saw them. Accounts describe scent clouds drifting over the countryside like invisible ambassadors delivering bad news. The smell wasn't one problem, it was the blend. Horse manure, pig droppings, butcher blood, stray feathers, animal urine, market waste mud stirred together with optimism. Summer heat intensified everything. Winter cold preserved smells like historical artifacts. Spring rains turned the streets into a slurry, whose consistency medieval writers politely described as less than pleasant. Animal waste and urban life, the daily struggle. For medieval citizens, the constant presence of animal waste was simply reality. They navigated roads by the instinct. Avoid fresh piles. Step over older ones carefully. Pray, nothing splashed. Hope a passing horse didn't express itself at the wrong moment. Consider moving only if fully necessary. Cleaning crews existed, but they couldn't keep up. The streets produced waste faster than humans could shovel it, and so towns accepted the cycle of manure and movement the way one accepts the weather, with resignation and the occasional curse. The accidental hazards people slipped. Wagons skidded. Shoes were ruined. The hems of dresses suffered fates too tragic for embroidery to save, so children played games in streets that doubled as barnyard floors. Dogs rolled in things they found exciting but humans found alarming. Even business dealings weren't safe. Merchants haggled while stepping around manure like dancers performing a reluctant choreography. And yet, medieval people adapted. This was simply life. You dealt with it. You washed your shoes when you could. You accepted that your clothing would always smell faintly of outside. You developed impressive dodging reflexes, and when travelling, you recognised the scent of home long before the city walls appeared. Medieval people didn't ignore animal waste. They just accepted it as an inevitable part of living in close contact with animals, a necessary inconvenience in a world that relied entirely on beasts for food, transport, labour and survival. The streets were messy, smelly, unpredictable and full of four-leg chaos. But in the Middle Ages, that was normal. If you have ever walked into a room, wrinkled your nose and thought, oh no, What is that smell? Then congratulations, you have experienced what medieval people did not. Because in the Middle Ages, the real secret to surviving daily life wasn't strong soap, good hygiene or fresh air. It was nose blindness, a superpower, a coping mechanism, a biological surrender. Medieval Europe operated under a cloud of odours so thick, layered, so fiercely competitive that the human brain eventually did what all overwhelmed systems do. It gave up. Your olfactory nerves, overworked and undersupported, would have thrown in a resignation letter and begged for early retirement. Medieval brains, however, had long since adjusted. They lived in a world where smell wasn't an alert. It was background noise. Let's start with the fundamental scientific truth. Your nose gets used to smells. It has to. If it didn't, your brain would overload every time you entered a kitchen, a locker room, or a medieval town square. The olfactory system prioritizes new smells, unfamiliar ones, dangerous ones, food-related ones. Everything else fades into the background like a medieval lute player who's been strumming the same tune for 5 hours. And medieval people? They lived inside a continuous scent marathon. Layer 1. Personal odour. We're not rehashing bathing or laundry habits, those are safely covered in earlier chapters, but it's important to recognise that medieval people carried a personal scent profile that built up day after day. Clothing absorbed sweat, hair absorbed smoke, shoes absorbed life's tragedies. Houses had one room, one fire, one atmosphere, and one shared scent. Every medieval person smelled like the sum of their day. Work, heat, weather, and proximity to animals, kitchens, and people. But when everyone around you has similar levels of aroma, you don't notice anything. Your brain shrugs and says, "This is normal now." Layer 2. Homes without ventilation. Most medieval homes were built like boxes, small windows, thick walls, low roofs, and fireplaces that produced smoke whether you wanted them to or not. Rushes on the floor trapped crumbs, spills, dust, pollen, insects, and whatever had fallen there in the last 6 months. Wet wool hung over chairs to dry. Food simmered all day in a pot large enough to qualify as a swamp. To our modern noses, stepping into these homes would have felt like entering the inside of a stew that had turned philosophical. To them, comforting, familiar, it smelled like home. Layer 3, the outdoors was worse. Stepping outside did not improve things, or medieval city air carried animal waste in bulk, butcher shop residues, smoke from 1,000 chimneys, markets full of fish, cheese, and questionable moral decisions, tanners working with lime and hides, dyers boiling vats of pungent chemicals, open drains circulating unsupervised chaos. Your nose didn't get a break. Your nose quit. But because the outside was always potent, medieval brains simply lowered their sensitivity. The smell was constant, predictable, and therefore ignorable, like background street noise or a neighbour's rooster who doesn't understand sunrise. Why medieval people didn't notice the smell? The simplest explanation: scent adaptation. The olfactory system is designed to detect changes in scent, not constant smells. A steady odour fades within minutes because the brain deprioritizes it. This is why you notice your friend's perfume but not your own. It's why you notice someone else's cooking but not the lingering garlic smell in your own kitchen. Now, multiply that science by medieval life, where potent odours weren't just an occasional occurrence. They were 24/7 roommates. Odours that were constant became irrelevant. Medieval people were not walking around fainting from the smell of each other. Their noses had simply adapted to an environment where smelling everything was impossible anyway. The nose-blind spectrum. Medieval noses existed on a spectrum. Fully adapted populace could walk past a butcher shop, a horse pile, a fish stall, and a tanning pit while discussing dinner plans. Newcomers to towns often recorded the smell in journals as a traumatic sensory event. Travellers from rural villages took one whiff of city life and immediately understood why cities had walls, presumably to keep the scent inside. Monks and nuns sometimes commented on smells in spiritual texts, usually blaming them on moral decline or the devil having a bad day. Animals didn't care. Smells medieval people didn't notice. Because their baseline was so intense, medieval people only noticed specific smells when something was suddenly different, something was extremely pleasant, something signaled danger, something hinted at decay that was unusual even for their standards. They responded strongly to sweet perfume, freshly baked bread, newly cut herbs, smoke signalling fire, rotten meat beyond normal spoilage, poisonous vapours, exotic spices from faraway lands. Good smells were powerful precisely because they stood out in a world where neutrality was rare. The science behind the overworked medieval nose. Your olfactory system connects directly to the brain's emotional and memory centres. In modern life, we're rarely bombarded with constant powerful odours, but medieval life was one big sensory assault. Medieval brains likely handled smell differently, reduced olfactory fatigue. The brain simply couldn't keep firing alerts without burning out. It adjusted to block baseline odours entirely, stronger reactions to food smells. Because hunger was constant, the brain prioritised scent signals that hinted at calories. Emotional insulation. If you live among strong smells long enough, you stop having emotional reactions. Medieval people didn't wrinkle their noses, they adjusted emotionally and physically. Neural triage. The brain filtered out 90% of the odour environment to focus on essential sensory tasks, sounds, threats, weather shifts. Your modern olfactory system, unused to such conditions, would have panicked. The medieval philosophy of smell. Interestingly, medieval people didn't think the world smelled bad. They thought certain people smelled bad, especially when sick, morally corrupt, or coming from unfamiliar regions. The environment? That was simply air. They didn't have the concept of clean smell or fresh smell. They had only pleasant neutral concerning, dear heaven, what is that? The medieval nose wasn't stronger. It was more exhausted, more pragmatic, more desensitized by daily exposure to powerful, unrelenting sensory conditions. Where modern noses scream, medieval noses sighed politely and carried on. Because in the Middle Ages, smell wasn't a crisis. It was the background soundtrack of life. If there is one medieval hygiene habit that perfectly represents the gap between intention and execution, it is hand washing. In theory, medieval people believed in clean hands. They genuinely did. They talked about it, wrote about it, ritualized it, and treated pre-meal rinsing as a mark of decency. In practice, well, let's just say medieval hands could have been submitted to museums as archaeological samples in their natural environment. Hand washing in the Middle Ages was less about actual cleanliness and more about symbolism, a performative nod to hygiene rather than hygiene itself. People didn't know about germs, sanitation science, or cross-contamination, but they did know that hands got dirty, and dirty hands before a meal made you look uncouth, suspicious, or morally compromised. So they rinsed them, sort of. Let's begin with the core truth. Medieval hand washing was mostly water-based, rarely soap-based. Soap was expensive, soap was scarce. Soap was often reserved for laundry or for bathing on rare, ambitious days. Many families owned soap, but it was stored like treasure and used sparingly, sometimes only for holidays, ritual washings, childbirth, or major contamination events. Everyday hand washing, however, involved nothing more than water poured over your hands, water that frequently came from a shared basin, a jug, or a bucket that had been sitting there long enough to question its life choices. The pre-meal hand wash, a ritual without results. Meals, especially formal ones, often began with hand washing. At a noble feast, servants carried around basins and poured clean, or clean-adjacent, water over diners' hands. This wasn't meant to scrub away grime, it was a ceremonial act, almost like saying grace with your fingers. The setup looked refined. A servant held a basin. Another poured water from a jug. Diners extended their hands gracefully. A linen cloth, shared, of course, was offered for drying. Elegant, right? Except no soap, no scrubbing, often no attempt to remove dirt stuck under nails. Hands that fed livestock, chopped wood, kneaded dough, carried firewood, braided rope, tended gardens, or handled money were cleaned with a polite drizzle. It wasn't hygiene, it was hospitality. A way of saying, welcome to my table, let us all pretend our hands look nice. The dirty water problem. Even when people wanted clean hands, the available water wasn't always clean. Wells could be contaminated. Buckets collected dust. Basins gathered sediment. Rivers were, well, rivers, see Chapter 3. If you washed your hands outdoors, you were probably cleaning them next to a goose with opinions. Water stored indoors didn't stay pristine either. Dust, soot from hearth fires, insects, and stray leaves all contributed to the general texture of medieval water. Medieval hand washing often resulted in cleaner hands, dirty water, then dirty hands again when using a communal towel. It was a cycle, a tragic, inevitable cycle. Why soap was rarely used. Let's talk soap. Medieval soap existed, sometimes harsh, sometimes fine and scented, but it was not common for daily hand hygiene. There were three main reasons. 1. Cost soap required animal fat, ashes or impregnated oils. That made it a commodity. Poor families rationed it. Rich families used it selectively. Nobody wasted it on the hands of children who were going to run back into the mud anyway. 2. Effort. Using soap meant lathering, scrubbing, rinsing and drying. When water had to be hauled by the hand, the idea of washing your hands thoroughly 4 times a day was laughable. 3. Beliefs. Medieval people didn't associate soap with killing invisible threats. They associated it with removing visible dirt. If your hands looked fine, they were fine. Daily life, daily hands. Consider what the average medieval hand went through. Handling raw wool, butchering meat, grinding grain, harvesting, crops, feeding livestock, cutting herbs, carrying firewood, milking animals, sewing with dirty thread, pulling up weeds, cleaning tools, handling money, which was filthy even then, touching door latches covered by 5 previous hands, and after all this, a splash of water, a wipe on an apron, good to go. This is why medieval hands often appeared rugged, cracked, darkened, scraped and well worn. They weren't neglected, they were simply used constantly in a world without gloves, sinks or moisturizer. Fingernails, the legendary archives of dirt. Fingernails were the real treasure troves of medieval life. They collected soil dye residue, ash meat juices, plant matter, ink, dust from weaving, soot from everyday fire tending, flour, rope, fibres. People trimmed nails on occasion, but cleaning under them wasn't a priority. Scholars wrote with ink-stained hands, cooks prepared meals with earth under their nails, and weavers had permanent dye stripes on their fingertips. A medieval hand was a biography, and no amount of rinsing would hide the plot. The medical community's hand-washing advice. Spoiler confused. Medieval physicians believed in washing hands, but not for the reasons we understand today. They recommended rinsing to cool the body's excess heat, refresh the spirits, prevent the humours from rising, avoid dryness of the palms. Not one medical text mentions germ prevention. Not one. What they did emphasise, ironically, was not washing hands too often, especially in cold seasons, because cold water weakened the nerves. In other words, wash, but not too much. Moderation, please. Public hand-washing stations, rare but real. Some larger towns had public fountains or basins where people rinsed their hands and faces, not because they needed cleanliness, but because washing was tied to respectability, refreshment, social norms, religious purification rituals. Still no soap. So little benefit. Why medieval hands could pass as archaeological artifacts. If an archaeologist today found a perfectly preserved medieval hand, it might look like leathered skin from sun and work, hardened calluses, cracks from dryness, dirt embedded in creases, stains from daily labour, nails thickened by repetitive wear. In short, a hand that had lived a life of non-stop labour and almost no pampered hygiene. The final word on medieval hand washing: medieval people believed in clean hands. They just didn't practice the detailed, soapy, germ-conscious kind of clean we demand today. Their version was quick, ritualistic, water-only shared, symbolic, and mostly ineffective. But for their world, their resources, and their understanding of hygiene, it felt perfectly adequate. In the Middle Ages, hands weren't expected to be pristine. They were expected to be useful, and they certainly were. If you have ever seen a cooking video where someone forgets to wash their hands after touching raw chicken and thought, yikes, that's dangerous, medieval kitchens would like to show you their entire lifestyle. Because in the Middle Ages, kitchen hygiene didn't just break health codes didn't exist yet. And if they had, medieval cooks would have snapped them in half like overcooked breadsticks. Medieval cooking was a heroic daily struggle in which food, fire, tools, animals, insects, and unwashed hands all mingled together with bold confidence. Kitchens were the heart of the home, but they were also battlegrounds of cross-contamination long before that word even existed. Let's step into a medieval kitchen, but watch your step. Something is definitely moving over there. The kitchen, where ingredients and chaos shared a table. Medieval kitchens varied from smoky huts to great hall complexes with dozens of workers, but almost all had the same basic features: an open fire, a cauldron or two, a table or slab for chopping, tools that were valuable but rarely washed thoroughly, a floor that collected everything from spilled soup to the emotional aftermath of kitchen disasters. Wooden surfaces were nearly impossible to keep clean, especially when knives carved meat directly on them day after day. They absorbed juices and stains like medieval sponges that no one ever wrung out. Food pieces fell onto the floor constantly. In lower-class homes, people usually picked them up and tossed them back into the pot, sometimes with the helpful comment of, "It'll boil." In wealthier kitchens, dogs were the floor-cleaning crew. Their enthusiasm wasn't sanitary, but it was effective. Cross-contamination. The house-special medieval cooks didn't have dedicated cutting boards for raw meat, vegetables, herbs and bread. Instead, everything went onto the same surface with the attitude of, what's the worst that could happen? Well, sickness. But medieval people didn't know that. Raw chicken was chopped beside fresh produce. Fish was gutted where ale was brewed. Herbs were crushed beside still bleeding joints of meat. And if someone sliced a loaf of bread right after chopping pork, no one blinked. Knives were wiped, not washed. Bowls were rinsed, not scrubbed. Spoons were shared, tasted from, stirred with, and then used again to serve guests. It wasn't carelessness, it was normal. Cold storage didn't exist, so anything that required preservation just had to be eaten fast, salted, smoked, or entrusted to fate. Speaking of which, raw meat. That just kept sitting there. If you walked into a medieval kitchen, you might see raw meat, hanging from hooks, sitting on counters, resting in bowls, aging unintentionally, and occasionally being politely ignored by everyone. Meat could sit out for hours, sometimes days, depending on weather, workload, forgetfulness, the belief that fresh air helps things keep. In cooler months, meat survived longer. In summer, well, let's just say the kitchen flies feasted before the humans did. Salt, vinegar, honey, and smoking techniques helped preserve some foods, but mostly medieval cooking relied on speed. Cook it now, eat it now, hope for the best later. Food poisoning existed, of course. Medieval people simply called it summer sickness, stomach fever, a humoral imbalance, or God's lesson in moderation. Spoiled food didn't always make people sick because their digestive systems were hardened by years of exposure to questionable meals. But when it did, they blamed the stars, fate, or their sins. Never their chopping board. Flour, grain, and the bugs that came free with purchase. If you opened a medieval container of flour, you did not expect to see a clean, white powder. You expected weevils, beetles, larvae, possibly worms, and a concerning amount of texture. No household threw away buggy flour. That would have been wasteful. Instead, cooks sifted out the biggest offenders, shrugged at the smaller ones, and kept baking. Bread wasn't just food, it was a protein source. Grain storage often attracted mice, rats, and birds. 2. Their droppings were common contaminants. If you accidentally baked in a few bits of rodent residue, well, that's what the body's humours were for, apparently. The fire will kill it. The confidence of medieval cooks. Medieval cooks genuinely believed that heat was the great purifier. If the food was boiled long enough, roasted hot enough, or stewed thoroughly, then everything unpleasant was burned away. This belief made cooks boldly unconcerned about germs, because germs weren't a concept yet. Heat solved everything. Dropped meat, cook it. Suspicious smell, add herbs and boil it. Weird texture, cook it longer. Strange colour, add sauce. Accidentally touched by someone who just mucked a pig pen. The fire will kill it. And often, remarkably, it did. Medieval cooking frequently involved long cooking times, stews simmered all day, meats roasted for hours, vegetables cooked until they collapsed from exhaustion. Culinarily tragic, sometimes sanitarily helpful, absolutely. Kitchen animals, assistants or contaminators, dogs, cats, chickens, and even the occasional pig wandered freely through kitchens doing whatever they pleased. Stealing scraps, knocking over bowls, walking directly on preparation tables, drinking spilled milk, scaring rats while also contributing their own mess. Cats were beloved for rodent control, but they also slept on counters. Chickens wandered in looking for grain. Dogs hovered underfoot hoping for drippings to fall. Animals were part of the workflow and part of the mess. Hands, the untested tools of culinary fate. Medieval cooks used their hands for everything, mixing dough, cleaning fish, shaping, pastries, tearing bread, handling money during market purchases, wiping sweat, scratching itches, petting animals, and then going right back to kneading dough again. Hand washing before cooking was uncommon unless a host wanted to impress guests. Otherwise, good enough was the standard. But here's the twist. Medieval food still had genius. Despite all this chaos, medieval food could be extraordinary. Heavily seasoned, deeply cooked, richly flavoured, inventive. Herbs killed some bacteria, ferments preserved ingredients, long cooking neutralised risks, and constant exposure hardened immune systems in ways that would terrify modern doctors. Medieval kitchens were unsanitary, undeniably. But they were also the beating heart of daily life, bursting with creativity, necessity, and resilience. If modern kitchens follow health codes, medieval kitchens followed one rule. If you can eat it without immediately dying, it's dinner. If you've ever flopped onto a modern mattress and thought, wow, this isn't as soft as I'd like, medieval beds would love to introduce themselves and gently or violently lower your expectations. Because in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't restful, it wasn't cozy, it wasn't sweet dreams, it was survival, and the thing you were sleeping on wasn't a mattress. It was a temporary truce between you and whatever was living inside it. Welcome to medieval bedding, where softness was measured in degrees of discomfort. Beds were humid in all the wrong ways. And turning the straw wasn't an act of cleaning so much as a gamble with fate. Straw mattresses, nature's itchy blanket. The medieval mattress was called a pallet, and it was usually a big cloth bag stuffed with straw, not decorative straw, not carefully harvested straw, but whatever straw existed nearby. Straw that broke into tiny pieces, stabbed you through the cloth, collected dust, absorbed sweat, made an audible crunch every time you moved, and hosted enough insects to qualify as a medieval ecosystem. The idea of slipping into bed for comfort was foreign. You didn't settle into a straw mattress, you negotiated with it. The straw wasn't soft. It flattened over time, shifting into odd clumps that gave every mattress a personality, and not necessarily one you liked. Beds developed pits, ridges, and mysterious lumps that moved without permission. Sleeping was less a restful posture and more a quest for a tolerable angle. Humidity, the enemy under the blanket. Straw mattresses did not breathe well. They absorbed moisture from sweat-spilled drinks, leaky roofs, damp air. The breath of people sleeping together, and the general medieval atmosphere, which was perpetually a bit moist, this moisture accumulated, turning mattresses into semi-damp sponges that slowly fermented under the weight of nightly use. The smell, think earthy, with notes of regrets. If you shared a bed, and almost everyone did, the humidity doubled. Families slept together for warmth. Servants shared beds. Travellers shared beds. Inns sometimes put 3 strangers to a mattress and called it hospitality. Within moments, human warmth produced steam. People woke up feeling like pastries in a low-effort sauna. Monthly turning of the straw. Maintenance or masochism. Because straw beds degraded quickly, households had a ritual. Turning the straw once a month or longer depending on ambition. Families dumped out the old straw, shook the mattress cover and refilled it with new straw. It should have been simple. It was not. Here's what typically happened. Someone emptied the mattress. The straw fell out in a cloud of dust, bugs, loose feathers and surprise debris. People sneezed. Someone screamed because a rat hopped out. Everyone questioned their life choices. The mattress was refilled with fresh straw that looked clean for exactly 12 hours. Old straw wasn't always discarded. In poorer homes, it was repurposed as floor covering, garden mulch, or insulation, with all the microbial joy that entailed. Even with monthly turning, mattresses never became clean. They became less crunchy, and that was considered a win. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, the night shift crew. Parasites loved bedding more passionately than medieval people did. And why wouldn't they? Straw beds offered warmth, darkness, moisture, human hosts, endless hiding places, and no competition from cleaning products. Fleas nested deep inside, bedbugs crawled along seams, lice migrated from bodies to bedding and back again like tiny commuters with an excellent public transportation system. You didn't sleep on a mattress. You slept with its entire population. Waking up with bites wasn't unusual. It was expected. People scratched so much at night that it became part of the soundscape of sleep. If scratching became rhythmic, it counted as music. Moulds and mildews, mattress mysteries, moisture plus organic material plus long-term use equals mould. Medieval mattresses developed dark spots, musty scents, strange patches, occasional fuzz, and an ambience that was, in a word, biological. If you slept on the same side every night, that side developed a unique ecosystem of its own. People didn't understand mould scientifically, but they knew a bad-smelling mattress was unhealthy. Their solution was usually move the mattress, air it outside, pray flip it, ignore it. Fresh air helped somewhat, but only until the mattress absorbed new humidity the next night. Blankets and sheets, no escape. There. Either bedding didn't just include mattresses. Sheets, blankets and woolen coverings added to the nightmare. Sheets were expensive and rarely washed. Many families slept directly on the straw sack with only a blanket between them and the world. Wool blankets collected sweat, dust and smoke. They weren't soft, they were scratchy armour. Winter bedding made things worse. Heavy cloth or fur coverings trapped heat, which sounds lovely until you remember. Parasites love warmth. Humans sweat at night. Wool absorbs everything. Mattresses don't dry. Warm and cosy was warm and damp. Comfortable and snug was comfortable for the insects who lived in your bed. Bed sharing. Comfort meets chaos. It's chaos. Most medieval people did not have private beds. They shared with family, with visiting relatives, with travellers, with servants, with other workers, with children, with whoever scored space first, which meant more humidity, more movement, more insects, more chances of being kicked, more noise, less blanket for you, and absolutely no privacy. Why sweet dreams was purely theoretical. Imagine trying to sleep while scratching. Flea bites, listening to 3 people snoring, feeling the mattress shift as someone gets up, smelling damp straw, hoping nothing is crawling on your foot, sharing warmth in a humid, airless room, hearing the fire crackle or occasionally hiss because something unidentifiable fell into it. Dreams did happen, sure, but sweet ones, unlikely. Medieval people slept because exhaustion demanded it, not because the bed welcomed them. Sleep was practical, not pleasurable. A necessity, not a luxury. And yet, beds were loved. Despite everything, the bugs, the smell, the texture, the humidity, medieval people cherished their beds. They represented safety shelter, family rest after brutal labour, warmth in freezing winters, a fixed spot in a chaotic world. The mattress might not have been clean, it might not have been soft, it might not have been still, it might have been alive, but it was home. If you've ever run out of deodorant and thought, well, today will be interesting, medieval people would like to welcome you into their daily reality. Because in the Middle Ages, deodorant did exist, and sort of, but it worked about as well as whispering encouragement at a dragon. Sweat won, it always won. Medieval deodorant wasn't a battle, it was a polite suggestion. Let's begin with the central truth. People smelled. They knew they smelled. Their neighbours knew they smelled. The whole town knew. The solution wasn't to eliminate odour, that was impossible, but to manage it, or at least make it more socially acceptable. Sweat, the universal medieval perfume. Daily life required physical labour. People walked everywhere, worked for hours, cooked over hot fires, hauled water, tended animals, and wore layers of wool, linen, or leather. Even nobles, despite fewer chores, lived in houses heated by enormous fireplaces that turned rooms into smoky saunas. Everyone sweated, everyone smelled, and deodorant, medieval style, was the rough equivalent of trying to put out a barn fire using a teaspoon. Herbal powders, the medieval armpit sprinkle. One of the most common deodorizing attempts was herbal powder. Powders were made of crushed rosemary, ground sage, dried lavender, mint leaves, powdered iris root, crushed rose petals, orris root, sometimes even fine chalk. These powders were sprinkled under the arms, in the folds of clothing, or inside linen shirts. The idea was straightforward. If you can't stop sweating, at least smell faintly less like regret. But powders had problems. Sweat turned them into paste clumped into little herbal mud balls. Herbal mud balls did not smell good. The powder didn't stop sweating at all. Still, for a few precious minutes, people walked around smelling faintly floral, at least until the sweat reclaimed its territory. Scented oils, for those who wanted to smell fancy, briefly wealthier individuals used scented oils to mask odour. Oils were infused with rose, amber, jasmine, violet, citrus peel, musk, sandalwood. These oils were dabbed onto the wrists, neck, chest, and sometimes underarms. They were luxurious, expensive, beautifully aromatic, and completely defeated by the first sign of heat. Why? Because oil plus sweat equals a combination spell that can only be described as confusing. The oils didn't evaporate like modern perfume. They mixed with natural body odour. Sometimes this created a pleasant herbal musk blend. Other times, well, imagine rubbing roses onto a damp sheep and you have an approximate idea. Crushed mint mixtures, a fresh idea that fought hard and lost. Mint was one of the medieval world's favourite deodorising herbs. It was easy to grow. cheap strong smelling associated with cleanliness. People crushed mint leaves, mixed them with soft fats or oils, and rubbed the mixture onto areas prone to sweating. For a glorious half hour they smelled like a medieval mojito. Then the mint faded. The sweat didn't. Mint mixtures worked beautifully for social events that lasted as long as 2 songs played by a lute. Beyond that, mint was powerless. Armpit rituals, because even desperation has traditions. In some regions, people performed armpit cleaning rituals involving vinegar rinses, wine washes, rubbing salt on the skin, applying crushed herbs, washing with cold water, saying a quick prayer for olfactory mercy. Vinegar was especially popular because its sharp smell cut through body odour. Unfortunately, it also made people smell like salads. If you passed a medieval person smelling strongly of vinegar, you had no idea if they had just cleaned themselves or were preparing food. Possibly both. Salt rubbed onto the skin acted as a crude form of deodorant, temporarily killing odour-causing bacteria. But too much salt irritated the skin, turning armpits into the world's most uncomfortable spice racks. Clothing as deodorant. An unfortunate strategy. Medieval clothing layers did many things, none of them deodorizing. Linen shirts absorbed sweat, yes, but they didn't stop odour. In fact, the shirts themselves became metallic-smelling monuments to physical labour. People sometimes stuffed herbs inside their clothing, hoping the scent would infuse. It did, but it also mixed with sweat, smoke, and the general ambience of medieval living. Clothing hid the armpits but did not protect them. It merely trapped the smell closer to the body. Natural smell. Philosophies. When odour meant something, medieval people didn't see body odour as simply bad. It was symbolic. Some medical texts claimed strong odours meant strong humours. Excessive sweat was the body expelling corruption. Pleasant aromas indicated moral virtue. Bad smells suggested illness or imbalance. But since everyone had some degree of body odour, people became philosophical about it. Smell was part of existence, like weather or bad lute players. And ironically, the body odour of others didn't repulse medieval people unless it was unusual. Since everyone smelled, nobody noticed. Wind, the affordable medieval deodorant. One of the most reliable and widely used deodorizing agents was the wind. A breezy day was a blessing. A windless day was a curse. People arranged social gatherings near windows or in courtyards during warm weather, specifically so the air could move smells away. If someone approached from downwind, the encounter was safer. Upwind encounters, however, were a risk medieval people accepted just like rain or taxes. And yes, people absolutely moved seating arrangements depending on which way the wind blew. Being downwind of someone wasn't just good manners, it was self-preservation. Sweat, the final unsurpassed champion. No matter what medieval people tried, and they tried everything they could think of, sweat won every battle. Herbal powders wilted, oils faded, linen absorbed and then surrendered. Mint lost hope. Deodorizing rituals lasted minutes. Sweat simply existed. It seeped, evaporated, reappeared, and reminded everyone that life was hard and heat was relentless. But here's the strangest part. Medieval people didn't despair about odour the way we do. They accepted it as a fact of life, like gravity, taxes, and the fact that bread always fell butter side down. They wanted to smell nice. They tried to smell nice, but they understood that smelling good was temporary. What mattered wasn't smelling perfect, it was smelling less bad than yesterday. And in a world of heavy clothing, hard labour, smoky air, and no antiperspirant technology, that counted as victory. If modern medicine is a symphony of antiseptics, sterile tools, antibiotics, and trained professionals, medieval wound care was percussion, loud, improvised, and often performed with whatever objects happened to be nearby. Because in the Middle Ages, treating a wound wasn't about preventing infection, it was about convincing the injury not to get worse. And if it did get worse, well, that was between the patient and whichever saint handled flesh issues. Let's begin with the central truth. Most medieval people survived injuries not because treatments were effective, but because their immune systems were stubborn, and those who didn't survive, their infections weren't accidents, they were practically summoned by the treatments. Blood, dirt, and daily danger wounds were common. Life was sharp. Medieval people dealt with farming accidents, horse kicks, kitchen knife slips, tool mishaps, falling timber, street brawls, animal bites, arrow grazes, workplace hazards involving iron, wood, or pointy objects that should have been regulated by several safety posters. A cut wasn't, "Oh dear," it was "here we go." Before a wound was even treated, it had usually been exposed to dirt, sweat, rust, unwashed hands, animal hair, whatever was stuck under the fingernails of the person helping. The wound was already halfway to infection before medieval medicine even entered the room. Wine, the closest thing to an antiseptic. If you were lucky, truly, cosmically lucky, someone near you had a bottle of wine. Wine wasn't just a beverage, it was one of the few medieval liquids that accidentally helped clean wounds. Its alcohol content killed some bacteria, and pouring wine over a cut reduced the chance of infection by at least a fraction. Medieval healers believed wine strengthened the flesh and chased corruption. They weren't wrong. They also sometimes drank half the bottle before treating you, which improved their confidence but not necessarily the medical outcome. If wine wasn't available, water was used, water that often came from sources better suited for plot lines in horror stories. Honey, the surprisingly brilliant solution. Now, credit where due, medieval people did get one thing impressively correct. Honey. Honey was used as a wound dressing because it prevented bacterial growth, drew moisture out of wounds, formed a protective barrier, smelled considerably better than everything else in a medieval home. Honey was expensive, so it wasn't used on every small cut. But for serious injuries, healers sometimes slathered honey over the wound and wrapped it with linen. This treatment often outperformed all other methods by a landslide. Unfortunately, honey wasn't the only thing medieval medicine relied on. Cobwebs, nature's questionable band-aids. Cobwebs were surprisingly common in wound care, not because of symbolism or folklore, because they were there. Healers believed cobwebs helped blood clot, drew out bad humours, covered wounds neatly, were absorbent. And to be fair, old cobwebs do contain vitamin K, which contributes to clotting, but they also contained dirt, dead insects, dust, more dust. Whatever the spider had for breakfast, applying cobwebs to an open wound was the medical equivalent of saying, "Let's see what happens." Moss bandages, soft and also alive. Cloth was expensive, so people often used moss as bandaging material. Moss was soft, abundant, and absorbent, perfect qualities for a makeshift dressing. Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon sources especially mention moss-based wound pads. The downside, moss holds moisture. Moisture holds bacteria. Bacteria hold housewarming parties. Moss bandages helped stop bleeding, but also created a warm, damp environment for infection to thrive. Medieval healers didn't know that, of course. They saw green fluff and thought it looked comforting. Animal dung poultices, the treatment no one asked for. And now we arrive at the most infamous medieval wound treatment of all, animal dung. Yes, dung applied directly to wounds. Different cultures used. Goose droppings, cow dung, pig dung, sheep dung. Why? Because dung was believed to draw out poison, pull out infection, warm the flesh, restore balance between the bodily humours, be earthy and therefore stabilising modern translation. They had absolutely no idea. Dung did help with some swelling, possibly because it was cold and muddy, but the bacteria in droppings guaranteed infection. This is why many wounds that could have healed became life-ending complications. Dung poultices didn't just invite infection, they RSVP'd, sent a carriage, and held the door open. Herbs, helpful or hopeless, herbs were the most common healing tools. Some were genuinely effective, others less so. Effective herbs included yarrow, stops bleeding; comfrey, promotes tissue healing; marigold, antiseptic properties. Less helpful herbs included anything used because it smelled holy; herbs chosen for their shape, the doctrine of signatures; plants rubbed on wounds because a healer had a dream about them; random leaves applied with confidence and zero science. Herbs were often applied as poultices mixed with fats or oils, which helped keep the dressing in place but didn't prevent bacteria. Tools, sterilize, never heard of it. Medieval surgical tools were rarely washed beyond a quick rinse. If blood stuck, they scraped it. If rust built up, they shrugged. Instruments weren't sterilized but were sometimes wiped on cloth that had not been washed since the last plague outbreak. Surgeons used iron knives, bone saws, hooks, needles, hot irons for cauterizing their teeth, yes, teeth, and occasionally their very impressive fingernails. Everything was done close to fires, dirt floors, or wooden tables. Cauterization, the medieval reset button. When all else failed, or when nothing else was available, healers used hot irons to cauterize wounds. Advantages: killed bacteria, stopped bleeding; closed deep cuts, looked dramatic; disadvantages: more pain, massive tissue damage, long recovery. And the fact that sterilizing everything by turning it into charcoal has limits, but it often worked better than dung, so it remained popular. Infection, the uninvited guest who showed up. Constantly. Most infections weren't accidents. They were encouraged by dirt, invited by incorrect treatments, accelerated by lack of sanitation, celebrated by the bacteria that lived everywhere. Pus was considered normal, even healthy. Many healers believed wounds were supposed to produce laudable pus, which looked creamy and balanced. They didn't realize this meant the body was barely hanging on. People survive countless injuries today because we clean wounds. People survive medieval wounds because their immune system said, "Fine, I'll do it myself." A bottle of wine and a prayer. This wasn't just a phrase. It was the medieval medical workflow. Pour wine on the wound. Apply something, hopefully honey. Say a prayer. Hope the patient's humours cooperated. Watch closely for swelling. Prepare additional prayers just in case. Prayers mattered because medieval medicine blended physical treatment with spiritual intervention. If the wound healed, God helped. If it didn't, the patient was called home and no one blamed the dung. The final truth: medieval wound care wasn't cruel, it was limited. People did the best they could with what they knew, what they had, and what experience taught them. Sometimes their treatments were surprisingly brilliant. Sometimes they were astonishingly harmful. But every bandage, herb, cobweb, and spoonful of honey reflected the same thing: a desperate desire to survive in a world full of sharp edges. If you think modern babies are messy, sticky fingers, mysterious stains, sudden explosions of bodily fluids, medieval children would like to politely raise their hands, covered in something unidentifiable, and say, "Oh, sweetheart, you have no idea." Because in the Middle Ages, children were adorable, precious, and absolutely frail by modern hygiene standards. They were alive, lively, and always coated in some combination of milk, mud, crumbs, and destiny. Medieval child hygiene wasn't a collection of nurturing rituals. It was a heroic, ongoing attempt to keep small humans alive while life itself conspired against them. Let's begin with the truth. Medieval children were walking biohazards. Not intentionally, they were just little beings living in a world with no disinfectants, inconsistent baths, and absolutely no understanding of germs. Diapering, the rag system, also known as Lord Help Us. Forget soft disposable diapers or even efficient cloth systems. Medieval diapering was creative. Babies wore swaddling bands, long strips of cloth wrapped around their bodies to keep them warm, contained, and theoretically straight-limbed. Underneath the swaddling, parents used layers of rags, old linen scraps, bits of cloth too worn out for real clothing. Sometimes just nothing. If the weather was warm and the family was optimistic, diaper changes weren't frequent. Rags were rinsed, but not always scrubbed. Washing cloth required time, water, soap, rare, and effort, meaning rags were reused until they reached a point of, okay, maybe that's too crunchy to put back on the child. Babies leaked. Constantly, swaddling did its best. But medieval babies spent a good portion of their early life smelling faintly of milk and the type of dampness historians politely avoid describing. Baths, rare, ambitious, and usually cold. Infant baths did happen, but not often. Water had to be heated over a fire. Bathing rooms were cold, parents were busy, babies cried, resources were limited. Daily baths were unimaginable. A typical baby bath looked like this: a small wooden or ceramic tub, cold or lukewarm water, a quick splashdown, zero soap unless it was a special occasion, a cloth rub to remove the worst grime, a resigned sigh from everyone involved. Some children went long stretches with only simple wipe-downs, faces, hands, and the worst messes. The rest? Well, medieval babies developed something historians refer to as a protective grime layer. It insulated. It moisturized. It was present. Cradle boards, convenience meats, cleanliness concerns. Across many medieval European regions, caregivers used cradle boards, wooden frames or panels with padding to hold infants secure while mothers worked. Babies were wrapped tightly and placed on these boards, which could be hung from rafters, carried on backs, leaned against walls, rocked gently, or occasionally used as makeshift seats. Cradle boards kept babies safe, but they also kept them very contained, meaning accidents stayed inside the wrappings, smells stayed inside the wrappings, babies stayed inside the wrappings. Changing a child on a cradle board was as joyful as you might imagine, unwrapping a small, angry burrito that had been slowly marinating in its own environment. Spit-up buckets and the eternal milk situation. Medieval infants were breastfed, a good thing, but babies also spit up. Everywhere. Their constant milk diet meant their wardrobe consisted of linen shirts, tiny smocks, layers of fabric, all of which were frequently soaked in milk residue. Parents used small vomit buckets, bowls, or cloths for spit-up, but babies, as babies do, ignored all plans and aimed wherever inspiration struck. Spit-up soaked into rags, bedding, cradle, padding, clothing, hair, nearest adult body. Milk turned sour quickly in warm homes, meaning medieval nurseries had an ambient aroma of fermented dairy and ambition. Children and dirt, a relationship of pure, reckless love. Medieval children, once mobile, formed an intense emotional relationship with dirt. Dirt was free entertaining improved with water everywhere. Toddlers crawled on floors covered in rushes which held food scraps and insect bodies, played in mud, handled animals, grabbed objects off the ground, and tasted things that absolutely should not be tasted. They played in dust piles, animal yards, barn corners, garden patches, wood piles, workshops, and occasionally puddles of very concerning composition. No one followed them around with wipes. No one disinfected their toys. No one panicked if a toddler chewed on a stick that had recently been part of a chicken's afternoon adventure. Teething. Chew on whatever you find. When medieval babies teethed, parents offered them hard bread crusts, carved wooden sticks, leather straps, bones, cooled rocks, their own hands. Basically anything both chewable and not actively on fire. These items were rarely cleaned. Bones came from the kitchen, stones from the yard, bread from hands that had touched 12 other things already that morning. Babies gnawed with enthusiasm, drooling onto whatever wasn't nailed down. Teething objects often doubled as toys, rattles, or snack tools, none of which improved their hygiene rating. Hair care, if you could call it that. Infants and young children often had short hair or shaved patches, sometimes for lice control, sometimes for style. Their scalps were washed occasionally, but most of the time, baby hair, collected crumbs, absorbed milk, drips, stuck to dirt, matted into gentle chaos. Parents used combs or fingers to detangle, pulling out bits of straw or rush flooring with each pass. Small humans, big smells. Children smelled like the sum of their experiences: milk, damp wool, cradleboard padding, dirt, scraps of yesterday's lunch. Whatever they had licked, whatever had licked them. They were adorable, but they had an aura, a little cloud of medieval innocence mixed with barnyard realism. Parents loved them fiercely, of course. They kissed them, cuddled them, laughed with them. They accepted the smells as part of life. After all, adults didn't smell particularly fresh either. But here's the medieval twist. They grew strong because they were exposed to so much so early. Their immune systems strengthened. Their bodies adapted. They became resilient. They learned to handle their environment. Medieval children weren't delicate in the modern sense. They were survivors, shaped by the same conditions that made everyone's hygiene chaotic but functional. The reality medieval child hygiene wasn't neglectful. It was practical. Life was demanding. Resources were limited. Cleanliness existed, but it took a back seat to survival. Children were messy, loud, sticky, chaotic, curious, grubby, and wonderful. In other words, children. Just very, very medieval children. If you've ever complained about sweeping your kitchen floor or wiping down a dusty shelf, medieval housekeeping would like to hand you a wooden broom with half the bristles missing and say, "Good luck, and may your gods go with you." Because in the Middle Ages, cleaning the house didn't mean making things pristine. It meant struggling bravely against chaos using tools that barely qualified as tools, while the house itself actively fought back. Medieval homes weren't designed for cleanliness, they were designed for survival, which meant that housekeeping was less a chore and more a weekly act of courage. Let's begin with the foundation of medieval home hygiene. Rush floors, the ultimate decor choice that made your entire house smell like a barn that had given up hope. Rush floors, a beautiful idea that aged terribly. Most medieval floors weren't wood or stone, they were dirt. And because walking around on bare dirt made the house feel like a stable, people covered the floor with rushes, long plant stalks laid down in thick layers, sometimes mixed with herbs to freshen the home, straw bits of cloth, and whatever else happened to be lying around on day one. Rushes smelled delightful, earthy, grassy, cleanish. By day 30, they smelled like everything that had happened on them. Let's talk about what lived in and under rush flooring. Crumbs from every meal, meat scraps that are rolled off tables, dropped cheese, a scent that only strengthens with age, dust, animal hair, human hair, insects, more insects, organic matter that historians diplomatically call unidentified. Rushes, in theory, were supposed to be replaced a few times a year. In practice, families replaced them whenever they could no longer pretend the floor wasn't alive. When rushes were finally pulled up for cleaning, people often discovered mouse nests, flea colonies, mould, patches, bones from past meals, forgotten objects. A smell that could spiritually challenge even the strongest adult medieval spring cleaning was archaeology mixed with horror. Sweeping. A battle of broom versus floor, guess who won? Sweeping didn't really clean the home, it just moved debris around until it looked less intentional. Medieval brooms were made from tied twigs, stiff short, frequently falling apart, better suited for lightly annoying the dust than removing it. Sweeping rushes was pointless. You couldn't sweep through 6 inches of woven plant material. You could fluff them. You could rearrange them. You could pretend to tidy them. It was like trying to clean a shag carpet that had become feral. People did sweep exposed dirt floors around the hearth, but sweeping stirred up so much dust that the house often looked dirtier afterward. Many homemakers swept with the windows open, not because they expected the air to clear everything, but because the house needed somewhere for the dust to escape before it settled back down. Dust, the ever-present roommate. Dust in a medieval home didn't accumulate. It arrived daily. Where did it come from? Smoke from the hearth. Dirt tracked in from outside shedding. Rush floors. Dry mud falling off clothing animal. Dander, wind, crumbling plaster. The natural decay of literally everything dust-coated. Furniture shelves, tables, clothing pots, candles, people dusting wasn't really a thing, not in the clean, thorough way we imagine. Instead, people wiped down surfaces occasionally using a damp cloth or simply accepted the dust as part of the room now. If you were wealthy, you had servants regularly beating and shaking linens, rugs, and tapestries outdoors. If you weren't wealthy, your linen simply accumulated dust until shaking them created a small local weather event. Smoke-stained walls, medieval wallpaper. Every medieval home had a hearth, and hearths produced soot, smoke, and sticky residue that clung to walls like a medieval tattoo. Walls weren't painted in bright colours. They were darkened by resinous wood smoke, candle soot, oil lamp soot, years of indoor cooking, time itself. White walls turned brown walls turned black walls turned don't touch that unless you want a handful of history, and the smell of smoke also soaked into every beam, cloth and object. Even if a medieval home was clean, it still smelled like fire, damp wood smoke and the faint hint of whatever was cooking. If you entered medieval homes often, you probably carried the scent of medieval life with you everywhere. You were a mobile candle wick, furniture, dust's favourite vacation spot tables, benches, chests and beds, and see Chapter 18 for the nightmares lurking inside those, collected grime daily. Housekeepers wiped tables before and after meals, but wooden surfaces were porous and quickly became scratched, sticky, smoked grease spotted, embedded with crumbs and dirt. Cleaning methods included scraping with knives, scrubbing with sand, rubbing with coarse cloth, applying herbal water. Hoping the lighting was dim enough that guests wouldn't notice sand was surprisingly common. People sprinkled it on tabletops to help scour off grime, then brushed it away. The sand removed some dirt. It also added some. Infestations, the uninvited cleaning crew. Housekeeping wasn't just about mess, it was about surviving the creatures that thrived in mess. Common uninvited guests included mice, rats, fleas, mites, weevils, beetles, spiders, occasionally bats, and the occasional overly curious chicken. A clean medieval home was one where rats were outnumbered, fleas didn't bite constantly. The rushes were only mostly alive and no animal was currently nesting in the storage chest. Aspiration was important. Windows and light, a rare glimpse of clarity. Medieval homes had small windows, often covered with oiled cloth, thin parchment, wooden shutters. Glass, driven expensive. Because windows were small and rarely opened in cold seasons, houses were dim. This was not only climate-related, but it was strategic. Dim lighting hides dust, candles produce soot, oil lamps produce soot, fire created haze. Everything contributed to the ambience of "it's cleaner than it looks." Probably. Medieval deep cleaning, a seasonal trial. Once or twice a year, homes underwent a deeper cleaning which included removing rushes, scrubbing walls with lye water, washing linens, airing out bedding, beating rugs, polishing metalware, shooing out animals, sweeping absolutely every surface twice, and emotionally preparing for what the rushes would reveal. It was exhausting, it was time-consuming, it was overwhelming, and it made the house feel new for about a week. Why wishful thinking was a key cleaning tool. A medieval house could never be fully clean. It wasn't possible. Between smoke, dirt, animals, insects, old floors, constant labour, limited water, weak tools, outdoor lifestyles, and the medieval definition of acceptable, the home existed in a perpetual state of clean enough. Cleanliness wasn't the goal, manageability was. As long as the hearth was tidy, the table wiped, the rushes freshened sometimes, and the dust kept her from forming mountains, the home was considered well kept. The rest was handled by willpower, dim lighting, and good manners. If you've ever wondered why medieval hygiene was such a glorious disaster, the answer can be summed up in one sentence. Their medical beliefs actively sabotage them. This wasn't simple ignorance. It was a beautifully chaotic mixture of misunderstood science, philosophical optimism, fear of water, and physicians who believed that bathing might literally dissolve your strength. And with doctors like that, who needs enemies? Let's begin with the towering culprit behind centuries of questionable hygiene. Miasma theory, when bad smells became the big bad villain. Medieval medicine ran on miasma theory, the belief that foul odours cause disease. Not germs, not contaminated water, not parasites, smells. If something stank, it was dangerous. If something smelled sweet, it was healthy. If something smelled weird, best start praying. To medieval people, rotting garbage, deadly. Latrine odours, corrupting the spirit. Swamp gas, a floating assassin. Fresh flowers, literal medicine. Perfume, armour for your lungs. This explains why so many medieval people focused their limited hygiene efforts not on cleaning themselves, but on masking odours around them. They burned incense, carried panders, hung herbs and flapped linens, all in the hope of blocking bad air. But the irony is delicious. The real dangers, bacteria, parasites, contaminated water, had no smell at all. And the very things they trusted, strong fragrances, stale indoor air, seldom washed clothes, often made their environment worse. The four humours, when your body was basically soup. Another major influencer of medieval hygiene was humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine. According to this worldview, the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, hot and wet; phlegm, cold and wet; yellow bile, hot and dry; black bile, cold and dry. Health meant balance. Illness meant imbalance. And hygiene, well, hygiene was rarely considered a factor in sickness at all. Instead of suggesting people wash their hands or boil their drinking water, doctors advised bleeding the patient, inducing vomiting, purging intestines, fasting, eating specific foods, smelling herbs, avoiding certain emotions. Yes, really. What about washing your body? Not a priority. Sometimes even dangerous. If you bathed too often, doctors feared you could weaken your humours, cool your vital heat, or open the pores to evil air. Imagine being told that taking a bath might erase your life force like an early medieval factory reset. Fear of bathing, clean water, dirty reputation. Medieval people didn't avoid bathing because they hated being clean. They avoided it because physicians insisted that water could break the body's defences. Many doctors warned that warm water relaxed the body too much. Bathing made the skin porous. Porous skin allowed miasma to seep inside bathing. During certain seasons caused fevers. Bathing during menstruation was dangerous. Bathing after eating was deadly. Bathing when sick was suicidal. Some physicians outright claimed that frequent bathing made a person vulnerable, emotionally unstable, or morally weakened. In one medical text, a doctor warns that overbathing will soften the bones. Naturally, people got nervous. Better to stay dry than risk having your bones turn into medieval pudding. So instead of washing, many opted for changing linen shirts, brushing off dirt, perfuming themselves, airing clothes by the fire. Freezing through winter without touching water, people did bathe. Of course, especially in some regions and classes, but nowhere near as often as modern standards. And many avoided full-body immersion unless they absolutely had to. Doctors who believed water was the enemy unless it was wine. Perhaps the most unintentionally hilarious aspect of medieval hygiene is how medieval doctors viewed water and wine. To them, water equals suspicious, risky, cold, potentially poisonous. Wine equals purifying, warming, health-promoting, basically medicine. Doctors routinely recommended rinsing wounds with wine, drinking wine to rebalance the humours, bathing in wine vapour, taking wine for strength, using wine in place of water whenever possible. The modern equivalent would be your doctor saying, "Don't drink water, dear, it could kill you. However, please hydrate exclusively with Merlot," and many did. People drank diluted wine daily because they believed water wasn't safe. And honestly, in many towns, the water was contaminated. Unfortunately, wine didn't fix the hygiene issues. It merely allowed people to ignore them with confidence. Medical texts that made everything worse. Physicians weren't intentionally sabotaging public health. They were simply working with the best guesses of their time, and many of those guesses were wildly incorrect. Common medieval medical advice included: avoid bathing after eating meat. Don't wash your hair too often, it draws off brain moisture. Don't wash during cold seasons. Clean only the parts of the body that are visible to others. Avoid cold water, as it crushes the spirits. Avoid warm water, as it weakens the body's firmness, which left a narrow window of lukewarm, politely warm, morally neutral water that no one ever managed to find. Doctors also advised against opening windows too widely, changing the air in your home, exposing the skin, standing near people who had recently bathed. The result? People were afraid to touch water at the exact moment when they desperately needed to. Medical hierarchies that distrusted practical hygiene. Medieval physicians, university-trained. Barber surgeons, practical but low status. Midwives, experienced but undervalued. And folk healers, distrusted by scholars, all had conflicting beliefs. The result was a medical culture where practical hygiene knowledge was dismissed. Book knowledge was valued, even when incorrect. Doctors rarely saw real illness. Surgeons did the dirty work but had no authority. Midwives knew effective hygiene but were ignored. For example, midwives knew to wash their hands before childbirth, but physicians often mocked midwives for being uneducated women and accused them of making childbirth too clean. Meanwhile, physicians diagnosed patients from afar, often without touching them, because touching the sick was considered dangerous to one's personal humours. When hygiene was accidentally viewed as harmful, some cultural beliefs added to the chaos. Sweat was considered cleansing, so dirt was often left on the skin to draw out impurities. Dirt itself was believed to protect the body from bad air. Opening pores was feared, so washing vigorously was discouraged. Heavy clothing was encouraged to trap body heat and every smell. Regular bathing was sometimes associated with moral depravity or vanity. Even barbers who shaved and cleaned people were sometimes accused of weakening the body by removing hair that protected the brain. The end result, hygiene. Set back by science. Medieval people weren't dirty because they wanted to be. They were dirty because their doctors told them it was safer. They believed smells caused disease. Bathing made you vulnerable. Water was dangerous, wine was purifying. Bodies needed balance, not cleanliness. Dirt and sweat could be protective. Opening the skin via washing invited invisible dangers. Their world wasn't empty of logic, it just followed a very different one. And so medieval hygiene became one of history's greatest paradoxes. People avoided the very thing that would have saved their lives because their doctors told them it would kill them. After spending 23 chapters wading through medieval filth, parasites, suspicious medical advice and hygiene rituals held together by hope and herbal potpourri, you may be wondering, how did anyone think this was normal? How did people live surrounded by smells, dirt, communal everything and hygiene routines that would make a modern health inspector transcend into another dimension? The surprising answer is simple. Medieval people didn't just tolerate their hygiene realities, they adapted to them. Their definition of clean was as different from ours as comfortable mattress or sanitary kitchen, because cleanliness was not a universal standard. It was a cultural agreement, and the medieval world agreed on something very different. Let's explore why medieval hygiene made sense to medieval minds, and how it slowly, painfully, eventually changed. Clean was relative, not absolute. When everyone around you lives the same way, your baseline changes. Medieval people didn't compare their homes to sterile hospitals or lemon-scented bathrooms. They compared them to the neighbour's cottage, last year's condition, next town's market stalls, their grandparents' generation. If your house was swept, your rushes were recently replaced, your clothes aired out by the fire, and your body didn't smell unusually bad. You were clean by medieval metrics. Cleanliness wasn't about eliminating bacteria, avoiding contamination, sterilizing environments. It was about being socially acceptable, masking odors, managing visible dirt, avoiding embarrassing smells in public. Clean didn't mean sanitized. Clean meant prettied up enough that no one complains. Smell-shaped culture, literally. Soma wasn't a passive part of medieval life. It shaped etiquette, medicine, architecture, clothing choices, social norms, superstitions, trade practices. Because of miasma theory, the belief that bad smells caused illness, people valued fragrance more than cleanliness. Flowers, herbs, incense, scented oils and pomanders weren't accessories. They were self-defense units. Every level of society used smell to signal something. Good odor, it was health, virtue, refinement. Bad odor, it was decay, sin, corruption, danger neutral. Odor ill a miracle. Cities sprinkled herbs across streets before festivals. Churches burned incense to cleanse the air. People hung aromatic plants in windows. Medieval citizens lived in a world where scents were believed to fight sickness more effectively than clean water, and this belief influenced every hygiene decision they made. If you lived in that world, you wouldn't think bathing prevented disease, you'd think fragrance did. Adaptation, the human specialty. Medieval people evolved culturally, emotionally, and biologically to survive conditions that would flatten the modern immune system. They developed tolerance for strong smells, desensitized noses that filtered out background odor, resilience to contaminated environments, routines that made chaotic hygiene functional, religious rituals that supported cleanliness symbolically, social norms that helped them navigate filth without constant distress. They weren't walking around horrified by their environment. They were living their daily lives with the normal frustrations of any era. We adapt to traffic noise, sirens, digital overload, pollution and crowded cities. Medieval people adapted to, well, everything in this book. Why hygiene wasn't a priority. Several factors made medieval people view hygiene differently. 1. Limited resources. Water was hard to heat, soap was expensive, tools were primitive, cleaning required enormous physical labour. 2. Misunderstood science. Without germ theory, people didn't connect washing with health. Disease was believed to come from bad air, unbalanced humours, sin, seasonal changes, supernatural forces, not filth. 3. Community living. Privacy barely existed. Hygiene was communal. Shared beds, shared tubs, shared basins, shared tools, shared everything. If you were always surrounded by people, the idea of isolating bodily practices felt strange and unnecessary. 4. Hard labour. When every day involved physical work, farming, hauling, cooking, cleaning, dirt was unavoidable. Cleanliness became functional, not aesthetic. The turning point, how hygiene slowly improved. Despite medieval norms, hygiene did improve, slowly, unevenly, sometimes begrudgingly. 1. Trade and wealth. Expanded. Imported soaps, oils, textiles and perfumes became more available. Better fabrics equal more washability. Better tools equals cleaner homes. 2. Bathhouse culture rose and fell and rose again. In some regions, public bathhouses became popular until disease outbreaks, religious concerns, or economic changes disrupted them. Bathing never disappeared completely. It simply fluctuated with circumstances. 3. Urban regulations emerged. As towns grew, officials created rules, removing waste, cleaning streets, improving water systems, regulating butcher shops, managing tanning pits. These weren't modern standards, but they were progress. 4. Renaissance medicine. challenged old beliefs. New ideas circulated. Airflow matters, clean water matters, bathing isn't inherently dangerous, soap is useful, cities can be healthier, and perhaps just perhaps, smelling like a compost pile wasn't a moral necessity. 5. Germ theory revolutionized everything. Centuries later, the discovery of microbes transformed hygiene from an aesthetic choice to a life-saving necessity. It took a long time, longer than anyone wants to admit, but humanity eventually connected cleanliness with health. A world that made sense to them. Medieval people didn't wake up thinking, our hygiene is terrible. They woke up thinking, how do I feed my family today? How do I survive winter? How do I finish my work before sundown? Do I have enough firewood? Is my neighbour stealing my chickens again? Hygiene wasn't the priority. Survival was, and within their worldview, their habits were logical, rational, and culturally shared. Medieval hygiene wasn't disgusting because medieval people were lazy. It was disgusting because the world they lived in made it so, through necessity, misunderstanding, and the limitations of their time. But those same people built cathedrals, preserved knowledge, told stories, raised families, and shaped the world we inherited. They lived fully, passionately, and resourcefully, just with slightly fewer baths.